Not quite getting the results you want from ChatGPT? Wondering how you can use AI language models to your advantage? Then this course is for you. If you have spent any amount of time with AI language models like ChatGPT and Google Bard, you may have noticed the results can sometimes be a little frustrating. Effective prompt engineering is the secret sauce for getting the most out of AI. In this course, Treasure Porth will teach you the art and science of effective prompt engineering to get the most out of AI language models and help you become a better web developer. Treasure is a software engineer and she's a technical content developer at Scrimba.
Hi, FreeCodeCamp learners. Welcome to my course on prompt engineering for web developers. Prompt engineering is the art and science of communicating with AI to yield better, more precise, more robust results. AI interfaces like ChatGPT and Google Bard do a little bit of everything, from writing silly poems to summarizing large text to generating code snippets. This course is designed specifically with web developers in mind, so it's packed with ideas, strategies, and practice challenges that are going to help you get the most out of AI language models as a coder. You're going to learn how to use prompt engineering to transform an AI language model into a pair programming partner, a personal coding tutor, and even a career and interview coach. With the help of AI, you're going to be coding better and faster than you ever have before, so I hope you're excited. To get the most out of this course, you should have some experience writing JavaScript and React, but whether you're a senior dev or just starting out, there's something in this course for you. So thank you so much for joining me, and let's get started. Hello, prompt engineers. Welcome to my course on prompt engineering created specifically for web developers. We're entering a future in which web development is so much more than writing code. It's about leveraging artificial intelligence to supercharge your coding skills to build smarter and faster, and this course is all about showing you how. Firstly, though, hello, my name is Treasure. I've been a front-end developer since 2015 and a teacher and instructor for even longer than that. I switched careers after going through a boot camp, and I love traveling, karaoke, and singing in a choir. I've done hundreds of hours of research, coding, and experimentation with AI language models, and I'm really excited to share what I've learned with you. There's been so much buzz about AI recently that you've probably heard a lot about language models like ChatGPT or Google Bard by now, so I'm going to give you a very lightning fast definition. Language models are artificial intelligence tools that allow you to have human-like conversations with a computer. Language models like ChatGPT can help humans do pretty much anything involving words, whether it's ad copy, poetry, or helping you brainstorm a list of names for your new cat. I've split this course into 3 sections. The first section covers many tips, tricks, and strategies to design and refine your AI prompts to get the most out of interacting with AI language models. The second section is a collection of prompt ideas and examples exploring how you, as a developer, can use AI language models to generate, document, and debug your code, as well as use it as an interactive learning tool. You'll learn some practices to help you use AI as a pair programming partner, a rubber ducky, if you will, that not only listens to you, but helps you find solutions. And the last section is all about using AI language models to enhance your job search. I'll show you examples of how to use AI for everything from finding places to apply, to learning and practicing algorithmic coding challenges, to generating and practicing behavioral interview questions. For this course, we'll mostly be using OpenAI's public interface, commonly known as ChatGPT, with a little bit of Google Bard sprinkled in. I highly recommend that you follow along and experiment with your own prompts, and you can click on the logos to visit the public interfaces for these AI language models and sign up for an OpenAI account if you need to. Before we go any further, I want to quickly address a common question that pops up when people start learning about AI. Will AI replace developers or make it harder for me to break into the tech industry? Tragically, I'm not a time traveler or a psychic or even an expert on industry trends, so I can't definitively answer this question. But what I can say is that being a developer is so much more than being able to spit out code. It's about understanding the user and how to create products and services that are intuitive, pleasant to use, fast, and that solve real-world problems to make people's lives easier. It's about empathy and creative problem solving and innovation, working as part of a team, and the list goes on. At this moment in time, we still need humans to do that. And right now, language models are really only good at one thing, and that is guessing what word should come next, giving a sequence of words. At the end of the day, language models are simply trying to predict which word should come next. AI language models are also only as good as the data they're trained on. They are prone to making things up, and they become less effective as the complexity of your problems or your code bases goes up. So the short answer is no. In my opinion, AI is unfit to replace developers anytime soon. Language models are best used as tools to streamline the most tedious rote tasks of a developer, freeing us up to focus on bigger, more complex, more interesting problems. Now that that's settled and you know what you're in for, let's talk a bit about prerequisites. It's important to note that while you don't have to be an expert, you should have some experience with JavaScript and React to be successful in this course. As long as you've done some basic coding, this course should give you a wealth of ideas for how to harness the power of AI in your web dev workflow. So let's go, let's do it. The first step to getting the most out of AI is learning effective prompt engineering. So let's talk about what prompt engineering actually is. This is a relatively new term that you may have heard out in the wild in all of the talk about AI recently. And at first glance, you might assume, like I did, that prompt engineering is a way to say software engineering via prompting a language model. But it's actually a much more generalized term. Prompt engineering means crafting prompts to effectively guide a language model's responses. Here's another definition: designing and refining inputs to obtain your desired output. I like to think of prompt engineering as the art of getting AI to do what you want. Whether you want AI to write an essay or make art or produce code for you, how you engineer prompts depends largely on what you want the language model to produce. In our case, we're going to talk about prompt engineering specifically for front-end development, and our desired output is code or information about code. When it comes to AI-assisted coding, a well-engineered prompt ensures GPT's output is tailored to your specific needs. And it's going to mean hours of development time saved from repetitive boilerplate code, debugging, and a lot more. For the next part of the course, we're going to discuss prompt engineering specifically for front-end development, and here's a sneak peek of the basic strategies for effective prompt engineering. We need to be specific, use technical terms, provide context, give examples, and perhaps most importantly, iterate. So we're going to go through each one of these strategies, look at a ton of examples, and you're going to learn a wealth of great tips and tricks. It's going to be great. So let's dive into it. I'll meet you in the next scrim. Let's talk about the basics of writing effective prompts. It's very much a worthy endeavor to take the time to craft a great prompt when working with language models like GPT. A great prompt can mean the difference between broad and largely unhelpful responses from the AI to finely tuned outputs that save you potentially hours of time. I highly encourage you to follow along with me and try all of these prompt examples out yourself, and you can click on this image to go to GPT's public interface. Keep in mind as we start looking at examples that there's a certain randomness to how ChatGPT outputs information. So even if you enter in the exact same prompt, your output is probably going to be a little different from what ChatGPT has given me. How it responds depends on a variety of factors. Like I said, randomness, and it can also vary depending on your prompt history and which model you're using. So just keep that in mind. The responses will be similar most likely, but probably not exactly the same. Let's talk about strategies for effective prompt engineering. The first three are: be specific, use technical terms, and provide context. Here's an example of a not so great prompt. How do I center something? A slightly better example of this prompt would be: how do I center an element on a web page? And an even better example is: what's the best way to center a div element horizontally and vertically using CSS? Let's see what happens when we enter this into GPT. When I use the broad prompt, how do I center something? GPT says, well, I need more context. What are you trying to center, and how are you trying to center it? Are you talking about physical space or a digital environment? Are you centering in a word processor, on a website, graphic design software? More information, please. So then I prompt again with something a little bit more specific and a little more technical. I'm saying I want to center an element on a web page. Now GPT responds with, well, you can use cascading style sheets. There are several ways to achieve this, but it recommends that we use Flexbox or CSS Grid. Notice here the assumptions that GPT is making based on our prompt. It's perhaps assuming that we may not know what cascading style sheets are, It then provides us with some code for the HTML and CSS for Flexbox and for Grid. Let's see what happens if I refine the prompt even further. This time I'm going to say, what's the best way to center a div element horizontally and vertically using CSS? So I'm providing more context. I'm saying I want to know what the best way is. I'm also being more specific. I'm saying I want specifically a div element and I want to center it both horizontally and vertically. And I'm also specifying the technology that I want ChatGPT to respond with, which is CSS. This results in a similar response. So it's still suggesting that we use Flexbox or CSS Grid, but this time it gives us some pros and cons for Flexbox, as well as some sample code and some pros and cons for Grid. So you can see how even the slightest tweak to a prompt can result in very different outputs from GPT. Let's look at another example. I'm going to start with the really broad prompt, how do I use reduce? With this prompt, GPT responds by explaining that reduce is a function that takes two arguments. But looking down a little further, you'll see that because we didn't specify a technology, it is providing an explanation of reduce in Python, followed by some sample code on how to use reduce in Python. So here's a small challenge for you. Think about how you would engineer the prompt if you wanted a JavaScript example. Think about how you would engineer the prompt if you wanted to understand what JavaScript's reduce method is used for. In other words, some use cases. And also think about how you would engineer a prompt if you were a beginner and you wanted to make sure that GPT responds with simpler instructions. And also think about how you would engineer a prompt if you wanted GPT to incorporate all three of these assumptions. Go ahead and pause this scrim, go to ChatGPT's public interface, and play around with prompting based on these assumptions. And when you return, I will show you my inputs and outputs. Welcome back. Hopefully you found that exercise to be helpful. Let's have a look at how I engineered my prompts. First, I'm making sure to provide context, be more specific, and use technical terms by specifying the technology I want to use, the specific method that I want to learn about, and I'm asking GPT to provide examples of what I might use the reduce method for. GPT responds with a definition of what reduce is, followed by a step-by-step example of how you can use it. Great. It also very helpfully provides the example in a single code block so that I could copy and paste this into a scrim if I wanted. It also goes on to provide a more advanced use case of reduce, which is when it takes in an array of objects and transforms that array of objects into something else. In my next prompt, I again am specific about what language that I want to discuss the reduce method in, but this time I'm asking for its use cases specifically. So again, it provides a definition of reduce and then provides 5 instances in which it might be helpful to use reduce. So calculating the sum of an array of elements, finding the product of an array of elements, counting the occurrences of elements in an array, flattening a nested array, and transforming an array of objects into an object with a specific structure, which happens to be the example that it showed us last time. And in my final example, I'm again asking for JavaScript's reduce method, and I'm asking GPT to explain it to me as if I'm a beginning developer just learning how to code. I'm also asking for a very specific example. I want to know how I can use reduce to calculate the total price of several items in a shopping cart. You'll notice that the result is that GPT's output is a much longer and more detailed explanation of reduce using slightly less technical language. It reminds us what arrays are and carefully explains how the reduce method works by going through each element in the array one by one and applying a function that you define. It then provides a step-by-step shopping cart example, just like we asked for. Pretty cool. This has been just a few examples of how we can use specificity, technical language, and context to tweak GPT's output to get as close as possible to the information that we desire. We've seen how to use these strategies to get information about code and code samples. Now join me in the next scrim to discuss how we can use these principles to use GPT to produce usable code. I'll see you there. Let's talk about using specific, technical, and contextual prompts to get GPT to generate code. As an example, let's start with a very broad, non-specific, non-technical prompt with no context. And that prompt is, how do I create a form? GPT, trying to be as helpful as possible, responds that, well, there's lots of ways to make a form. You can use a form in HTML for a web page, you can use Google Forms, or you can even create a form in Microsoft Word. Then also continues to try to be helpful by providing examples of how you might get started creating a form using all three of these avenues. So here is a challenge for you. Think about how you would improve this prompt so that it is specific, technical, and provides context. And here is your context. You want to create a form that displays the reverse of whatever the user inputs into the form. Go ahead and pause, go to GPT's public interface, and play around with how you would engineer a prompt to produce this code. And when you return, I'll show you the prompt that I crafted. Welcome back. Were you able to create a form? Here's how I did it. I started by saying, please create a form in JavaScript with one input that accepts a string and, on submit, prints that word to the web page in reverse. So I'm being specific about what I want the form to do. I'm specifying that I want the form to be in JavaScript and that I intend to use it on a web page. GPT responds with the HTML and JavaScript that I need to complete this form. Let's quickly copy and paste this code in and see if it works. So I have my HTML and my JavaScript, and let's run this. And because I put my JavaScript into a file called index.js, I'm going to have to make sure to go ahead and change that in the HTML it generated. This is another way that we could improve the specificity of the prompt, by the way, is we could say, please assume that we have a JavaScript file called index.js, and that way GPT will change its code samples accordingly. But let's just go ahead and change it manually this time and see if this works. I'm going to type this is backwards and we'll submit. And there we go. Whatever we enter into the field is printed to the page backwards. Exactly what we wanted. Let's look at another quick example. This is a less broad prompt with a little bit of context. I'm saying, please show me an example React component. And GPT responds, making the assumption that I'm starting from ground zero. So it's saying, first, make sure that you have Node installed on your system and use create React app, navigate to the project directory, then open the source folder and put this into app.js. And it gives us an example of a little greeting component. It then tells us to run our create React app that we need to npm start. So it's trying to be as helpful as possible, but this may end up being way more information than we're looking for. And that is another thing to keep in mind when engineering a specific prompt and providing the proper context. So take a moment to think about how you might improve upon this prompt. And I want you to try to engineer a prompt based on all three of the following assumptions. You want GPT to assume that you already have a React project set up. Let's assume that you want to see an example of use effect in this example React component. And let's also assume that you want an atypical example and not the same examples that you see everywhere, like a counter component that simply increments a number by 1 every time you click a button, or a React component that simply says hello world. So go ahead and pause the scrim now, go to GPT's public interface, and engineer a prompt that addresses all three of these assumptions. I'll see you when you get back. Welcome back. Hopefully you were able to engineer a prompt that got you some helpful results. Let's have a look at my prompt. So my prompt is, please create an example React component that takes at least one prop and demonstrates how to use hooks like useState and useEffect. Now I've done something that can be incredibly helpful when prompt engineering. I'm specifying what I don't want GPT to respond with. So I'm saying the example should not be a typical hello world example like a counter or a greeting. And I'm saying assume that I have already set up a React project. So this time, given the specificity of our prompt, GPT skips all of the setup instructions that it included before, and it gives us this theme switcher example, which arguably could be the third most common example that is used when teaching React. But that's okay. It didn't give us what we specifically said we didn't want. So this is an area where we could play around and try to improve this prompt a little more to get an example that's perhaps a little more interesting. But other than that, it's given us what we wanted. We have a React example that uses useState and useEffect. We also get a pretty good explanation of how the example is working and some instruction on how to use it in our existing React project. When it comes to prompt engineering, specifically for coding or learning to code, specificity, technical language, and providing context will take you a long way. But there's still a bunch more to learn and a ton of new examples to try, and all sorts of ways that you can tweak your prompts to get as close to exactly what you want. So I look forward to seeing you in the next scrim, where we'll continue to talk about more prompt engineering tips. I will see you there. Now for a quiz and a bit of practice. I really encourage you as you're going through this course to spend as much time as you can trying out different prompts in ChatGPT. If you need a link to OpenAI's ChatGPT interface, I've included that right here. So keep in mind when you're actively practicing rather than passively watching the scrims, you're much more likely to retain the information. I've sprinkled challenges and opportunities for practice like this throughout the course, so do take your time to get your hands dirty. Like I said, it's going to really help you remember everything that you've learned. So we have a short quiz question for you to answer and a few less than ideal prompts that I'd like you to improve based on what you've learned so far. Go ahead and pause the scrim now and work on the quiz and practice. Welcome back. Hopefully that went well. Let's go over some possible answers. Our quiz question is, what are the three basic components of an effective prompt? And those are to be specific, use technical terms, and provide context. If we look at these suboptimal prompts, they are missing one or all of these things. So let's look at the first one. I need to loop through an array. Help. How could we rewrite this so that it's more specific, uses technical terms, and provides context? Your answers will most likely be a little different than mine, but let me show you the prompts that I came up with. For this one, I added some context and technical language by saying, in JavaScript, how can I utilize the for each method to iterate over an array of objects and extract a specific property from each? So I'm being specific about the language I want to work in and providing some context about what I want to do. For this second question, I want my website to look good on phones too. My prompt was, what are the recommended CSS media query breakpoints for mobile, tablet, and desktop views to ensure my website is responsive across various devices? So again, more specificity, more context, and more specificity around technical terms. Our third prompt is, I'm having issues bringing data into my React app. My prompt for this is, how can I use the useEffect hook in React to fetch data from a REST API endpoint and store the results in a local state using the useState hook? This is maybe a little more specific than I needed to be. So if you find your prompts aren't quite so specific, that's totally fine. As long as the basic elements are there, you're more likely to get more precise results. And that's it for the quiz and practice. To take this a little further, you can try entering both the vague prompt and the prompt you came up with into ChatGPT and note the differences between the two. The vague prompt might accidentally be correct or somewhat correct, or help you get to your desired answer, but generally a more precise prompt is going to save you time by yielding more precise results. This is one of my very favorite tips because there is so much that you can do with it. So let's talk about all the ways you can fine-tune GPT's responses by controlling the length and format. Especially when you're trying to learn something new with GPT, these are some really effective ways to get as much or as little information as you want in some formats you may not have thought about before. Let's look at some examples. I could request information like this. I could say, provide a brief two-step explanation of creating a custom JavaScript event. And GPT responds with an explanation that has exactly two steps. I can say something like, please compare CSS Grid and Flexbox, highlighting their main differences and use cases in a tabular format. So I'm requesting the response as a table. And GPT responds with this great little table that compares Grid to Flexbox in the way that I've specified. It's pretty awesome. I can also get extremely specific. So I want to know why inner HTML should be avoided, why we shouldn't use it. So I'll ask GPT to summarize in exactly 3 bullet points why inner HTML shouldn't be used. I also want each bullet point to be followed by a short explanation and a code example of what I should use instead. Here's GPT's response. I get exactly 3 bullet points. We shouldn't use inner HTML due to security risks, performance issues, and accessibility issues. It can cause problems for screen readers and other assistive technologies. GPT recommends some other things that we can use and shows us an example as we've requested. This is a really good example of how granular we can be when controlling the length and formatting of a response from GPT. A question that we get asked a lot here at Scrimba is how much JavaScript should I know and be comfortable with before I start learning React? Let's see what GPT thinks. My prompt is, please list the 5 most important JavaScript concepts a beginning developer should be comfortable with before learning React. I want the response to be brief though, so I'm going to be really specific about the kind of response that I want. So I'll go on to say, please provide a 1-sentence explanation of each concept and 1 sentence about why it is important for learning React. Let's see how it worked out. This is fairly close to what we requested. We have exactly 5 JavaScript concepts, variables and data types, functions and scope, arrays and objects, control flow and conditionals, and asynchronous programming and promises. And then we get a 1-sentence explanation of what that JavaScript concept is and why it is important to learn for React. So for example, understanding how to work with asynchronous code using callbacks and promises is crucial for handling events, making API calls, and handling state updates in React. This isn't exactly what we asked for, but it's pretty close. And if we wanted to, we could go back and refine the prompt a little bit if that's what we wanted to do. I can also ask GPT to create flowcharts. So here I've asked, please create a flowchart describing how to submit a pull request using GitHub. And it creates a text-based flowchart outlining all of the steps, from forking the repository all the way down to creating a new pull request on GitHub and choosing which branches I want to merge. If you ask me, this is a really cool way to begin to understand a concept with a ton of steps. I can also ask GPT to create pseudocode. Please create pseudocode in the form of code comments describing how I can write a React component that displays the time in a user's local time zone. I'm requesting that pseudocode in the form of code comments because I've discovered that when I ask for pseudocode, it tends to give me code that sort of looks like Python. And what I want are step-by-step instructions for how I can code this function myself. And code comments are what's most effective for me. So let's see what GPT did. In the form of code comments, it's broken down into small steps with even more specific instructions. So this would be great if I really want to make sure that I'm writing my own code, but I desire some step-by-step help to help me think through how I might structure my code. Here are even more examples. I can control the length by requesting a definition in 1 paragraph or 1 sentence. I can even specify that I want a response in so many words or less. This is also one of my favorites. I can request a TLDR of a topic, which, if you're not familiar, stands for too long, didn't read. It's basically another way of saying, give me a short explanation. So I can say, TLDR, explain the difference between let and const in JavaScript. I can request a specific task in a specific technology, but request the solution without using any external tools or libraries. I can ask for explanations in the form of analogies and metaphors. I can also copy and paste GPT some code and ask for an explanation via code comments on every line explaining what the code does. And finally, here's another one that I use a lot and we will see more of later. I can prompt GPT with, in your response, please only include the code that needs to be modified. And this is really helpful if you're having GPT generate some more complex code for you. It does have a tendency to print out all of the code every single time. And this way you can ask for just what needs to be modified. We will talk much more about this in later scrims. Now that we've looked at quite a few examples, please take a second to think about how prompting to control the length and format of the response can be helpful to you. Go ahead really quick, think of a topic that you're unfamiliar with or that you've always meant to look more into, and ask GPT for an overview in whichever format you feel would be helpful. And definitely use the examples on this list or the other examples that we've looked at for inspiration. For example, I was recently contributing to an open source project that uses Redux, which I'm not very familiar with. Pause now, give it a try, and when you come back, I will show you yet another example of how I prompted to get the response in the exact format I was looking for. Welcome back. Hopefully, that was a really good exploration. So, as I said, I wanted to know more about Redux. So, my prompt was please explain how to use Redux step by step using a simple code example, such as tracking whether or not a user is logged in. So, I'm asking for a response in a step by step format using a specific code example. And then I'm getting even more granular by requesting one sentence that explains each step. But then once GPT has provided me with a step-by-step explanation of Redux with the code sample that I've specified, I wanted to make up an acronym for me that's going to help me remember all of the steps I need to remember to use Redux. If you're at all familiar with Redux or have ever tried to learn it, there are a lot of steps. Let's look at the response I was able to get. GPT says, here's a step-by-step guide on how to use Redux with a simple code example to track user login status. Thank you, that's exactly what I asked for. We'll use the acronym CARTS as a reminder of the steps. It's a pretty good acronym. It's easy to remember. It's an actual word. So then using this acronym, it breaks down the steps. We're going to create a Redux store, do some action creators, and then here is the one sentence explanation of each step that I requested. It goes on and shows me the rest of the steps. And then at the end, it says, remember the acronym CARTS to help you remember the steps for using Redux in a React application. And it goes on to summarize the acronym that I requested. Prompting GPT in a way that controls the format and length of its responses is a super powerful way to use GPT both as a learning tool and as a time saver when coding up features. This is really worth getting comfortable with. So I really encourage you to just take some time right now before moving on to the next scrim to choose a few coding concepts you've always meant to look into a bit more and explore them with GPT using a variety of formats. Definitely refer back to the slides and to the list of examples. This is going to get you familiar with all the many ways you can prompt GPT to share information with you. Time for a bit of a challenge. You're going to design some prompts to build a small application that generates haikus. If you're unfamiliar with haikus, it is a poem with a 575 syllable structure. So if we take a look at this example, I asked ChatGPT to generate a haiku for me that was about prompt engineering, and this is what it came up with. Crafting questions sharp, guiding thought with precision, answers clearer shine. If you were to count the syllables in this poem, you would find that the first line has 5 syllables, the second line has 7 syllables, and the third line again has 5 syllables. Your task will be to prompt ChatGPT to write you code for a very simple application where you'll push a button here in the mini browser and it will generate and display a randomly generated haiku. So I've given you 3 vague suboptimal prompts that I want you to improve. You'll improve these prompts using all of the techniques that you've learned so far and then use those prompts with ChatGPT to generate some code. You can then copy and paste the code you've generated right here in the scrim into this JS file to make sure that your prompts have yielded code that does what you expect. Let's quickly read over the prompts that you'll be improving. The first is make some lists of phrases for a haiku. I want them to be about artificial intelligence. The second is combine the phrases into haiku. And the third suboptimal prompt is make the haikus show up when I press a button. I've asked for haikus about artificial intelligence here, but feel free to generate haikus about whatever subject you want. Rainbows, unicorns, math, it's up to you. Also, these prompts don't give you a ton of hints as far as how to structure your code. So if you need some help on that, you can go ahead and take a look at this hints.md file for some guidance. Before you get started, I have one final important disclaimer. You may have noticed that the title of this scrim and this file is Haiku-ish generator, and that is because for reasons unknown, ChatGPT is not great at counting syllables and will sometimes produce phrases that are a syllable or two off. For the purposes of this challenge, we're not going to worry about that, but if you want to ensure 100% accurate results, you can manually count the number of syllables in the list of phrases that you generate or ask ChatGPT to break down each line and count the syllables for you. Have fun with this. Go ahead and pause the scrim now and get started on the challenge. Welcome back. I hope you had a fun time generating haikus. Let me show you the prompts that I came up with. The first prompt that I wanted you to improve is make some lists of phrases for a haiku. I want them to be about artificial intelligence. Here is my improved prompt. Generate 3 JavaScript arrays for a haiku generator where each array represents a line of the haiku. The first and third arrays should contain phrases with 5 syllables, and the second array should contain phrases with 7 syllables. All the phrases should relate to artificial intelligence. Here are the lines for my Haiku-ish generator that ChatGPT came up with. We have an array of phrases for each line of the poem. The phrases for line 1 contain more or less 5 syllables. The phrases for line 2 contain more or less 7 syllables. And the phrases for the third line of the poem contain more or less 5 syllables. The second prompt that we needed to improve was combine the phrases into a haiku. This is my improved prompt for that. Write a JavaScript function to randomly select one string from the 3 arrays of strings and return a combined string where each haiku is on a separate line. This prompt yielded the following function. So we have this generate haiku function that takes in 3 arrays containing phrases for possible haikus. There is a get random line function that takes in an array and chooses a random item from that array, in this case, a random line for a poem. And it then calls the getRandomLine function 3 times, one for each line of the poem. It saves each line into its own variable and finally returns a string containing the 3 randomly chosen lines concatenated with a line break in between each. The third and final prompt that I asked you to improve was make the haikus show up when I press a button. My improved prompt for this was create a button in JavaScript that, when clicked, triggers the generate haiku function and displays the haiku to the web page. From this prompt, I was able to get an event listener that is attached to an element with the ID of generate button. And when clicked, it calls the generate haiku function and sets the text content of an element with the ID of haiku output to the result of the generate haiku function. It also generated a couple of lines of HTML, which I will copy and paste into my index. We have a button with the ID of generate button and a pre-tag with the ID of haiku output. I have my generate haiku button, and when I click it, I get random haikus. Fantastic. In this scrim, you've built a haiku generator application in just 3 prompts. If you've spent any amount of time with ChatGPT, you may be thinking, well, this could have been done with just 1 prompt. And while that's most likely true, when you're using ChatGPT, it's good practice to always be thinking about how to split projects into smaller tasks. More on that in the next scrim. Excellent work on this challenge, or in the form of a haiku. Challenge met with grace. Generator speaks in verse. Student claims their place. See you in the next one. With the right prompts, AI is surprisingly, sometimes frighteningly capable. And because it's so capable, our first impulse might be to stretch it out as far as it can go. How much can I make it do? How few prompts can I get away with? Can I get a whole app with a single prompt? The answer is yes, you probably can, but the results might be a little meh. Think of it this way. Say you're building a brick wall like this adorable little penguin. If you were to build it by hand, you'd probably go brick by brick, right? Making sure that each element was in its place before moving on to the next one. You wouldn't throw all the bricks and all the mortar into a pile and smear it around until it sort of resembled a wall. But one of the pitfalls of AI is that it's tempting to do this with code. It's really tempting to hand AI a list of instructions and try to mold whatever it spits out into a workable application. This is why I advocate instead that when you build with AI, you break everything down into smaller chunks. And that means the tasks that you're trying to accomplish with AI, as well as the instructions that you prompt the AI with, and the features that you choose to build. I also can't stress enough the importance of taking time to read and understand the code that AI generates along the way. So why should you do this? Breaking it down into smaller steps is going to be better for manageability, for learning and understanding the code, and for isolating bugs and other issues. It is possible to get AI to spit out a whole React app in one go, but the more complex the thing you ask for, the more likely there are to be errors and inconsistencies, and the less likely you are to understand the code or feel any sense of ownership over it. So it's really easy to get trapped in a cycle where you don't understand the code you're working with. You ask ChatGPT to debug it, it solves one issue but introduces another, and on until the brick wall crumbles and you storm away frustrated. Am I speaking from experience? Yes. Let me show you an example. So what I'm after is to build this budget tracker. Basically, in the form, you can put a budget title, your budget, how much of that budget you've actually spent, and then you can add it to this nice little visualizer that represents your budget versus how much you've spent as a progress bar. Here's what happens when I try to do this in one big prompt. So we're going to read all of this really quick. My huge prompt is, help me build a small React application to help users visualize their budget. The application should consist of a form with 3 inputs: a budget title, a total budget, and current expenditures. When the user submits the form, a progress bar should be added to the page. The progress bar should be green if less than 50% of the budget has been reached, orange if more than 75% of the budget has been reached, and red if 100% or more of the budget has been reached. The app should keep track of the total budget and total expenditures and display a large progress bar with this info at the top of the page. Users should also be able to delete and edit progress bars. Create JSON for 4 example budget progress bars and assume I already have a React project set up. This is a very tall order. There is a lot of stuff, and the AI is smart, but telling it to do all of this at once is going to make it more apt to forget things. So I ended up with something like this. As you can see, this somewhat resembles what I asked for. We have some budgets. We have the total budget and the amount spent. We have a little form, and it does work, but the following things are wrong. There are no progress bars, and that is because AI forgot to set a height for the progress bar. So they're there, but they're invisible. It also completely ignored my request for add and delete functionality, which is honestly understandable because that adds a great deal of complexity to the application, and it ignored my request for a main larger progress bar that represents the total overall budget. Not spectacular results. So take a second and think about how you would break this down. I don't think that there's necessarily a right answer here. I think it's going to depend a lot on how your brain works and how you tend to build code in the first place. But some suggestions are you could break the task down by structure and style, as in you could do all of the HTML and then the CSS and then worry about functionality. This is a React app, so you could build each component one by one. You could concentrate on certain features or any other number of possibilities. But let me show you how I did it. I'm going to concentrate first on building the budget form component. My prompt is help me build a small React application that helps users visualize their budget. Make sure it meets the following requirements. And then I'm breaking down tasks into a list. Making a list makes it a little bit less likely that AI is going to leave things out. So this is another component of breaking things down into smaller tasks within a prompt. So I say number 1, include a form component with 3 inputs. And number 2, I'm going to describe the functionality. When the form is submitted, add the new budget to an array of budgets. Here's what the output looked like, and this is what we end up with. So it's pretty simple so far, but I can add a budget, let's say rent, and it simply adds the budget with the total amount of the budget and how much we spent. Now I want to make the form look nice. So I'll say add styles to the form with 3 bullet points. It should be responsive. I want the form fields to be stacked, and the fields are styled similar to Bootstrap fields, but don't use any outside libraries. And that yields some CSS, which I will go ahead and drop into the CSS file. And that is a pretty nice looking form with just a couple of prompts. I'll now move on to displaying my budgets in a progress bar. So using this same format, I'm going to say each progress bar component should have the following, and then I'll make a list. I want to display the budget title, the budget versus how much we've spent below the progress bar, and then the color scheme that I wanted for the progress bar. So if you're close to reaching your budget, it'll be red. If you haven't spent much of your budget, it'll be green. Then I specify that my progress bar should be thick with rounded corners. This yields some progress bar CSS, which I will put in my CSS file. It also gave me some progress bar code, which I already have in this file called progress bar. And finally, inside of my app, it instructed me to rewrite this map function to use the progress bar rather than simply mapping through the array. We'll go ahead and replace all of this code. And what's happening now is we are collecting the budget data from the budget form. We're adding it to this hook that is keeping track of all of the budget objects inside of an array. We're then mapping through the array of budgets and passing that information to a progress bar that has all of the progress bar styles and information about how we want to display it. Let's run and add a budget. And there we go. We have a working budget tracker that displays a progress bar. I can then continue to iterate on this project in small steps. For example, I can ask it to create some dummy data so that we can see what our application looks like with a bunch of budgets. I'll add that here. Here are our budgets with a bunch of dummy data. And then finally, I can take care of a couple of bugs. As you can see, the progress bar gets too long if you go over budget. So for our entertainment budget, we've overspent by $50, making the progress bar too wide. I also want to change these harsh colors. So I'll ask it for one final task before we wrap up this scrim. The width of the progress bar should never exceed 100%. If the spent amount exceeds the budget amount, make the budget/spent progress bar text red. Display the spent budget text as a dollar amount and use dark pastel colors for the progress bars. So let's copy and paste the refactored code and run. And this is pretty close to what I had in mind. This scrim has been about building iteratively and breaking up complex tasks into smaller steps. As the tasks you complete with AI grow more complex, remember to ask yourself, how can I keep breaking it down? Let's pause for a second to take a quick quiz to help things stick a little better. Read through the quiz questions and answer them to the best of your ability. Go ahead and pause the scrim now and start working on it. Welcome back. So, why can it be helpful to break down a project into smaller steps, even if the language model is smart enough to handle it? My answer is that overall, it makes the project more manageable. It helps you to more thoroughly understand the code and more effectively discover bugs and other issues. It helps you avoid a situation where you have a lot of code that you are unfamiliar with and not sure how it works because ChatGPT has generated all of it for you. The second question is, how would you break down the following prompt into smaller tasks? And as I said, you didn't have to worry about actually writing the prompts. I just wanted you to think about how the app could be broken down in a high level way to be built incrementally with the help of ChatGPT. There's going to be a lot of variations in answers here because everyone's a little different, but here's how I would break it up. I would start with the pet list and layout part of the application. Whether or not I wanted the list to display as a gallery or as a straight vertical list and all of the components that I might need for that. Then I would worry about the responsiveness of the pet list and layout. I'd then move on to accessibility. Finally, I would look at filtering the list of pets, building a pet detail page, and finally, I would worry about styling. This isn't all inclusive, of course, and some of this could be broken down into sub steps, but hopefully that gives you a general idea. So that's it for this quiz. Thanks for taking the time and great work. When you're using a language model like ChatGPT to help you build an application, it might be tempting to assume that when you ask ChatGPT to produce something for you and it fails, that the language model is simply not capable of that task. And sure, there are plenty of things that ChatGPT is not great at. Like the time I tried to get it to write fiction. Ugh, not good. But I'm sure with the right prompts, you could get close to ChatGPT doing even that, because making a few tweaks to your prompts can make a huge difference. This is a strategy called iterative prompting. Iterative prompting is the process of prompting, evaluating the AI's response, and either revising your prompts to get as close to your desired outcome as possible, or clarifying what you want with a follow-up prompt. Let's look at a couple of simple examples. I have an HTML table that has some information about board games. Let's say that it represents the inventory for a store called Roll With It Games. I start with the prompt, please create a product web page based on this HTML table. And the result looks something like this. It isn't bad, it's simple, bold colors. I like the addition of a buy now button. I think that makes a lot of sense. But what I really had in mind was more of a gallery layout where each board game is a card in a row of cards. Also, if you were to look at the code example, you would notice that this is all hard coded and the HTML and CSS is all in one file, which isn't exactly what I want. So I'm going to iterate on my prompt, tweaking it to be a little more specific. I kept my original prompt, please create a web page based on this HTML table. Now I'm going to add use a responsive gallery format where each product is a tile. Then I'll say convert the data in the HTML table to JSON and use JavaScript to loop through and display each game. So that will take care of my problem with it being hard-coded. Here's where things start to get a little messy. It starts by converting my HTML table to JSON, but then if you look at the code it gives me, everything is still in the same file, which is fine. I didn't specify that I wanted it to be split, but it also added a second games array of objects. I have this whole JSON file that isn't being used. So there are sort of two ways that you can iterate on a prompt, and this is the first one, wherein I have clicked this edit button and simply changed the prompt and had the AI completely regenerate a response. If you're unfamiliar with the interface, you can then use these right and left arrows to rifle through all of the prompts and responses, which can be pretty handy in some cases. And by the way, this says 3 out of 3 because on my second attempt, ChatGPT errored out and I had to regenerate because of that. Revising a prompt like this can be really helpful if what you generated is not close to what you want. However, in this case, let's take a look at the output. So in some ways, this is closer to what I wanted. I have each game as a tile. I have some issues with responsiveness that I would need to work on. As you can see, because there are 4 cards, one is kind of in the middle of the second row, which may or may not be what I want. But I've also lost the buy now buttons and the color scheme that I was kind of fond of. So maybe I didn't really want to start all over. What I can do is I can go back to my original prompt. So I'll click back through to my original prompt, and I can continue the conversation with this prompt. And instead of revising it, I'm going to add a follow-up prompt. And my follow-up prompt will break down all of the changes that I want to make. So as a list, I would like the AI to break the code into separate CSS, JS, and HTML files. I want to extract the data from the HTML table into a JSON file. And I want to create a function to loop through the JSON and display each game as a card in a responsive gallery format. And so through iterating with a follow-up prompt, here's what I end up with. I have the best of both worlds, which is the gallery format that I was after, plus the buy now button and the green color scheme. So to wrap things up, remember that iterative prompting is all about trial and error, plus a bit of creativity and persistence. If you follow this process, prompting, evaluating the output, and either revising or writing a follow-up prompt, it's going to make it that much easier to achieve smoother, more predictable results. Let's learn a little prompt engineering inception, using AI to optimize and improve your prompts, and then feed those prompts back into the AI for the most effective results. The strategy involves 2 stages. The first is asking ChatGPT to interview you about your needs so it can then craft an optimized prompt for you based on those needs. Stage 2 is using the prompt to prompt ChatGPT to maximize the quality of your desired output. Let's look at an example. My first prompt will be, I'm going to give you a prompt and I want you to help me optimize it. Ask me clarifying questions, then suggest a more effective prompt that will yield a more accurate and detailed output. ChatGPT says, absolutely, I'd be happy to help you optimize your prompt. Please share it with me. I'll then give it the prompt, please give me some example code for React accordion menu. Now that I've asked ChatGPT to interview me, it will come back with a list of clarifying questions that's going to help me be more specific about what I'm looking for. And this is cool because not only will it result in a more refined prompt, but it's also kind of like a built-in brainstorming session. So ChatGPT says to optimize it, I'd like to ask a few clarifying questions. Would you prefer that the accordion menu be made of class components or functional components using hooks? Are there any specific features you'd like the accordion menu to have, like multiple sections open at the same time, animations, or accessibility features? Will there be any specific data structure for the content of the accordion, or will it be text only? And finally, would you like to use a specific styling strategy? Followed by some suggestions for styling strategies that I could use. I'm going to go down the list and answer each question. I want functional components. For my features, I'll say I want a smooth open and close animation. I want only one section to be open at a time, and I'd like to use the Open Sans Google font. I want my accordion to accept JSON data, and I also am going to ask the AI to generate some dummy data for me. And finally, I'll tell it I just want to use a regular external style sheet. I've given ChatGPT a lot of detail about what I want here. This strategy has helped me provide a lot of clarification on what I actually want. ChatGPT responds, could you provide me with example code for React accordion menu that meets the following requirements? Followed by a summary of the requirements based on my answers from the previous prompt. So I can now dump this back into ChatGPT as a much more specific, contextual, refined prompt. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm now going to prompt with this optimized prompt. ChatGPT responds with some example code for an accordion, which I have copy and pasted into the script. So let's take a look. We have the dummy data we asked for. We are using a functional component with hooks and a regular style sheet just like we asked for. And as you can see, this is a pretty good looking accordion menu for a couple of minutes worth of work. Let's do a little review of what we've just done. I'm going to come over to my accordion.jsx file. These are the steps I just went through to optimize my prompt. First, I prompted ChatGPT to ask clarifying questions about my prompt. I then answered ChatGPT's clarifying questions, and when ChatGPT returned an optimized prompt, I then fed it back to ChatGPT. And the result is hopefully a more finely tuned code snippet that includes all of the features that you were after. Definitely try this strategy out for yourself. I find that it works really well when I'm trying to do something relatively complex or when I'm murky or undecided on the details of what I need a function or React component to do. Time for a quick review and some more practice. We've just talked about a strategy for optimizing a prompt, and we did this in 3 steps. Your first prompt should be an overview of what you're trying to accomplish and a request for ChatGPT to ask you clarifying questions. Your second prompt will be answers to ChatGPT's clarifying questions. And after you answer the questions, ChatGPT will output an optimized prompt, which will then feed back into ChatGPT. Let's practice this by instructing ChatGPT to help us build a simple modal window. If you're unfamiliar, a modal is generally a secondary window that opens up on hover or button click on a website. So think about a pop-up payment form or a box that pops up where you might enter a username and password. What I'd like you to do is, starting with this prompt, show me a code snippet for a modal in React. Go to ChatGPT, I've included the link right here, and follow the steps to create a more optimized prompt. Then, just for fun, I've set up this scrim so that you can enter your code into this modal.jsx file just to test it out and see if it works. Modal windows can have a lot of options, and those will be up to you, but my advice would be to keep it as simple as possible. For example, I'm going to prompt for a modal that displays a box of text on button click, and that's really all it's going to do. Go ahead and pause the scrim now and start working on this challenge. All right, we are back. Let me show you the prompt that I came up with. My prompt was, I'm going to give you a prompt and I want you to ask me clarifying questions to help optimize the prompt. Suggest a more effective prompt based on my answer. Here's the prompt. Show me a code snippet for a modal in React. And here are the clarifying questions that ChatGPT asked me. Yours will probably be a bit different, but the general idea should be the same. ChatGPT wants me to clarify if I want a functional component or a class component in React. Do I want the modal to be styled with plain CSS, SCSS, or a specific library like styled components? Do I want the modal to open and close based on a button click? Are there any specific content types that I want inside the modal, like text, images, or a form? Do I want any transition effects for when the modal appears or disappears? And am I using any state management tools like Redux, or do I want to use local component state? Here are my quick answers to these clarifying questions. I want a functional component. I want to use an external CSS style sheet. Yes, I want the modal to open and close on button click. Just displaying text is fine for now. I want my modal to use a simple fade in and fade out effect. And finally, I just want to use local component state. Based on the answers to these questions, here is the optimized prompt that ChatGPT came up with. That prompt is, provide a React functional component code snippet for a modal that utilizes an external CSS style sheet. The modal should display text content and open and close based on a button click. It should have a simple fade in out transition effect and manage its visibility using local component state. Just for fun, let's look at the modal code that ChatGPT output based on my optimized prompt. So I'll go to modal.jsx and copy and paste that code in. So we have a clickable button that says toggle modal, and then we have some JSX for the modal code that's based on the local component state is open, which our toggle modal function toggles from true to false. Notice that we do have hard-coded modal info here, so that's something that we'd want to iteratively improve upon, but this is certainly a good start. ChatGPT also provided some CSS, which I will copy and paste into the CSS file. So we have some styles to make sure it has a semi-transparent background when it's open and some keyframes for some simple transition effects. Let's go ahead and open the mini browser and run this to test it out. Got my toggle modal button, and when I press it, there we go, a very simple modal. In this challenge, we've learned how to get ChatGPT working for us to create more effective prompts. Well done. Let's talk about a really interesting way to plan, learn, and create with AI. It's called role-based prompting. Role-based prompting is a strategy in which you ask a language model like ChatGPT to put on a costume, so to speak. You instruct the AI to take on a specific persona while interacting with you. For example, you might start a prompt with act as a or you are a. And as we'll see, you can have it act as a variety of things that will help you as a software engineer, like product manager, software architect, or even career coach, which we'll talk about in a later scrim. Let me show you how you can use role-based prompting to plan out basically an entire application. I'm going to start by asking the AI to act as an expert in system design and architecture and advise me on how to design the front end of a React application that helps users keep track of how often to water and fertilize their houseplants. This is a big comprehensive list. It's kind of broad and not super helpful right now, but it will be in just a moment. So my next prompt in the same chat window is going to be, you are now a product owner tasked with gathering requirements for this project. What features and functionality should this application have? Ask me clarifying questions if necessary. This is a really good strategy when you need AI to help you brainstorm, or when you want to try to get a different perspective than you might be able to come up with on your own. I'm instructing the AI to actually interview me about what I want out of my project. The AI immediately assumes the persona of a product owner and says it's my responsibility to ensure that the product we're creating truly meets the needs of our end users. Great. It then makes a list of basic functionalities and asks me some questions. So, do we need user accounts? What kind of plant information? Should the app include water and fertilizer reminders? Should there be a catalog of plants to choose from? And what about user preferences? So this is all good to think about, but very overwhelming at the moment. So I'm going to prompt again, kind of drill down. I'm going to say, let's concentrate on plant information first. That's the second one on the list. And the question was, what type of information should be tracked for each plant? For instance, do we need to track only watering and fertilizing schedules, or should we include other details like sunlight needs, optimal temperature, plant species, etc.? So as part of my prompt, I will say, let's include the nickname, an image, the watering and fertilizer frequency, the last time that the plant was watered, the last time it was fertilized, and also an additional place for notes. The AI then provides fleshed out requirements for the plant information functionality, as well as some information about the overall plant display. The date should be localized. The information should be presented in an intuitive and user-friendly format. That's great, but this is all still a little bit broad to be helpful to me, so I'm going to prompt again to drill down even more. I'm going to now ask the AI to assume a third role. I'm going to say, I now want you to act as a product manager. Please write user stories based on the above requirements. If you're not familiar with what a user story is, it's basically a way to explain how a software feature should work from the perspective of a user or a customer. So notice that I did not ask for a specific number of user stories, so the AI comes back with 13 user stories, which is very thorough. So you see we have, as a user, I want the app to calculate and display the number of days since each of my plants was last watered or fertilized so that I can easily see when they need care next. That's great. Another example is, as a user, I want to edit notes I've added for each plant so I can keep them current and useful. This is great. There are a lot of good ideas here, but this is still a huge long list. And as a software developer, I'm still overwhelmed. I don't really know where to start. I'm going to do another role-based prompt. You are the product manager of this application. Please advise me, as a software engineer, which stories are most necessary to create an MVP for prototyping and demo purposes. So basically, this prompt is asking the AI to pare down the list for me. What are the most important things that I should concentrate on first? So it picks 6 user stories, assigning a nickname, uploading an image of a plant, setting the watering and fertilizing frequency, and so on. So if I'm looking to build a demo or a personal project to put in my portfolio or something, I now have a really well-defined place to start, which is pretty cool. Now, if I want some more advice on where to start, how to structure, what technologies to use, I've had AI help me determine and plan so much of my application at this point that I can do one final role-based prompt. We're going to bring it back to the software architect and say, act as a software architect and give me advice on how to design the front end of a React application based on the following user stories. I'm then going to copy and paste the 6 user stories that the AI just determined for me and get some advice based on these user stories that I've worked with the UI to create. The Basically, ChatGPT then suggests a component hierarchy to start with, as well as some advice about all sorts of things like state management, handling images, calculating dates, and some user interface and UX stuff. So this will give me some really good ideas about how to get started. And then here is one of my favorite things. I can now do another role-based prompt that says, you and I are a software engineering team. Discuss the requirements for the first 3 user stories and turn them into tickets to be entered in Jira. And now AI says, sure, let's break down these user stories into individual tasks that can be created as tickets in Jira. So I have my user story, I have the tasks that go with it, and the acceptance criteria. So with role-based prompting, I've gotten some ideas about how to structure my app. I have determined the most important features. I've determined what I need for an MVP, and I've generated tickets for Jira. Now I can be off to the races building my app. So this has been a scrim about how to leverage AI to plan out an application using role-based prompt engineering. Now, this method may not work for software engineering teams building software out in the real world. It's often much, much more complicated than that. And there's a lot of back and forth and a lot of cooks in the kitchen when it comes to building software. But if you're looking to build a portfolio of personal projects for the purposes of getting a job, for example, or if you're a one-person startup company, this can be a really effective way to use ChatGPT as an idea engine and as a partner in brainstorming. So I hope you found this useful. Happy role playing. Let's do a quick review of role-based prompting followed by a little exercise. Role-based prompting is when you use phrases like act as a or you are a to prompt ChatGPT to assume a certain role. While assuming the role of an expert, you can prompt ChatGPT to ask clarifying questions, and you can also ask ChatGPT to assume a role to help you define technologies, determine key features, and write user stories when you're planning a project. So here's the scenario for the exercise. You want to use ChatGPT to help you build an MVP for a booking website that displays information on hotel resorts. An MVP, if you aren't familiar, stands for minimum viable product, and it's a way to describe an app that has the most bare bone features that you'll need in a working application. So you can think about like a very simple prototype of Airbnb or Expedia with no bells and whistles. All you can do is view information about resorts. Even an MVP of this type is going to be fairly complex once you think about all the pieces, so we're not going to try to get ChatGPT to build this site. We're just going to get a little bit of practice using role-based prompting to plan an application. So once again, you're going to use role-based prompting to get advice from ChatGPT on how to create an MVP for a booking website that simply displays information on hotel resorts. You'll want to start by writing a prompt that will yield a broad overview of all the things you might need to think about for an MVP. Chances are ChatGPT is going to point out a lot of things that you'll need to think about when planning this type of application. So just pick one area of focus and prompt ChatGPT to keep assuming a role and ask you clarifying questions to help you drill down into the area that you want to concentrate on planning. And once you've drilled that down, use ChatGPT to create 5 user stories for that area of focus. Don't forget to use role-based prompting here as well. Go ahead and pause the scrim now and start working on this challenge. Welcome back. I hope you came up with some great user stories. Let me show you my prompts. The prompt I started with is I want to build a simple booking website for resort hotels. Act as a product manager and help me identify features I should include in an MVP. As expected, ChatGPT came back with a lot of information. I'm going to copy and paste that in, and as you can see, there is a whole lot to think about here. User authentication, search functionality, resort listings, booking process, the list goes on and on. So the one that I'm going to choose to focus on is resort listings. So let me actually get rid of all of this other stuff so that we can better focus on resort listings. Here's a prompt I use to get ChatGPT to help me narrow down what I want to do with resort listings. My prompt was, let's focus on resort listings. Acting as a product manager, decide on the 5 most important features and write user stories for them. As requested, ChatGPT gives me 5 user stories, and that includes seeing a details page, high quality images, the ability to read reviews and see ratings, clear information on room availability, types, and their pricing, and so on. In this scrim, we've narrowed down a plan to start working on a complex application and written some user stories in just a few prompts. This can be a really helpful strategy for starting to plan an application, and especially if you're a new developer just starting out and trying to maybe build portfolio projects, it can also help you realize the scope of a project that you have in mind and help you narrow it or expand it accordingly. So great job on this challenge. One of the most effective ways to engineer a good prompt for ChatGPT is to show and not tell. In other words, prompting with examples of what you want ChatGPT to do. Let me show you a couple of examples. I'm going to prompt ChatGPT to write a function to total an array of numbers and return the value as a dollar amount. Rather than fiddling with this prompt and wondering if it's clear enough and if GPT is going to be able to parse what I'm saying, I'm going to include with my prompt an example input and an example output. So my input is an array of numbers, some with decimal points, and my example output is 172.5 formatted as US currency. GPT then responds with this function and even gives us a line of code with our example input so that we can test it. So let's copy and paste that into the scrim and see how it works. After I pasted it, I'll run. And as you can see, using the example input that we provided, the output is 172.50, which is the output we expected. Just for fun, let's try some different numbers. So 5 and 5 should be $10. Great. What if we just have one number in here? That'll be $8. And if we have an empty array, we get back $0. Great. Let's look at one more example. First, I'm going to ask ChatGPT to generate some dummy JSON data for me. I specify that I want it to be for music events, and I'm going to give it an example of all of the properties that I want my JSON to contain. So band name, the event date and time, ticket cost, venue, and genre. I'll then request that it only generate dummy data for 2 bands because I don't want the JSON data to be too long. GPT responds with some JSON data. I'm going to go ahead and comment out this first example and copy and paste this JSON data. Looks good. We have a little error because this isn't a JSON file, but that's okay. We'll fix that in a second. I then copied and pasted that JSON data back into a prompt. And my prompt is considering the following JSON data. So considering this example JSON data, please write a function that will take in this data and return a new object where the event date time is converted to a human readable format. I then include an example that has an additional property. And you'll notice that I actually made a little typo here. I write formatted data time when I meant formatted date time. But as you'll see, ChatGPT was actually smart enough to correct this for me. So this is my example output. I want the event date time to be converted to this nice human readable time, wherein instead of a jumble of letters and numbers, you can see that it says nicely May 15th, 2023 at 8 p.m. GPT responds with this format event data function. It puts my data into a variable for me and logs it out. Let's copy and paste this into the scrim and see how it did. Get rid of my example JSON and let's run. And you'll notice that it is taking in this array of objects that has 5 properties: band name, genre, event date, time, ticket cost, and venue. And it is returning an array of objects with 6 properties because despite my typo, it has added a property called formatted date time. And that is the power of prompt engineering with examples. If there is a way that you can show ChatGPT exactly what you would like your output to be, I highly recommend you do so. Now stay tuned for a fun little challenge where we'll prompt with examples to build a seltzer flavor generator. I'll see you in the next one. Welcome back, prompt engineers. Here is a fun little challenge that will give you some practice prompting by example. I don't know about you, but in my area of the world, flavored seltzer water is extremely popular. And there are hundreds of flavors ranging from pretty simple, like black cherry or pomegranate, to kind of out there, like raspberry rose, hibiscus cloudberry, and mango cherry bliss. all the way to downright bizarre. This is a real seltzer water flavor. It's called Yeti Mischief. They also have one called Unicorn Kisses and one called Dragon Whispers. I've had all three, and of course, I don't know what a real Dragon Whisper tastes like, but I guess I can believe that it tastes like a fruit bomb with a tropical punch. It was good. For this challenge, you will prompt GPT to create a function that generates random seltzer water flavors. Some examples might be funky raspberry pineapple, wacky strawberry whipped cream, zippy pineapple mango. The format that you want to follow here is adjective followed by a flavor followed by another flavor. And the flavor titles should be capitalized. So make sure that the code that you generate with ChatGPT capitalizes these flavors. You'll want to give GPT example inputs and outputs. The function that you produce should take in an array of adjectives, and an adjective is a describing word like funky or zippy or blue, and it should also take an array of flavors. So pineapple, mango, strawberry, whipped cream, all examples of flavors. Go ahead and ask GPT to generate these two arrays, the array of adjectives and the array of flavors. You decide if you want your flavors to be delicious, weird, bizarre, icky, inedible. It's your choice. Have fun with it. And then finally, test the function that GPT outputs. And if it doesn't work, or if GPT doesn't produce exactly what you've asked for, keep iterating on your prompt until you get the result that you want. Grab a mermaid song flavored seltzer and get started. I'll see you in the next scrum with the solution. Hey there, this is the solution to the flavor generator challenge. Your challenge was to prompt GPT to create a function to generate weird, wacky, or delicious random seltzer water flavors in the following format: an adjective followed by a flavor followed by another flavor. Here are some examples: funky raspberry pineapple, wacky strawberry whipped cream, etc. You were also to ensure that ChatGPT gave you the output you expected by giving example inputs and outputs. Let's take a look at the prompt that I wrote. Create a function that suggests new seltzer water flavors. I'm then going to be very specific about the arguments that the function should accept. So the function should accept two arguments, an array of flavors and an array of adjectives. The function should pick two flavors at random and return a new flavor in this format: adjective, flavor, flavor. I give it an example input, which is two arrays, one of flavors and one of adjectives. And then in my output, I make sure to follow the format I specified: an adjective followed by two flavors. Let's take a look at the code that ChatGPT generated based on this prompt. Copy and paste it into my index.js file. As you can see, it commented things nicely for me, which is helpful. It tends to do this randomly, so it can be really helpful to specify whether or not you want comments when you're asking GPT to generate a function for you. So inside the suggest new flavor function, we have a function to get a random index. We then use the function to get a random number between 0 and the length of the adjective array and save it to a constant. And then we use that random number to choose an adjective from the adjectives array. We're then doing something very similar to select the two flavors. We're using the get random index function to get two random numbers that we can then use to choose something out of the flavors array. Now, it seems confusing at first why it decided to save one to a const and one to a let, but that is because on the next line of code, we're looking at both of the random numbers that were chosen and we're ensuring that they aren't the same, so we don't end up with a double flavor like wacky apple apple or something, because that wouldn't make sense. It's really cool that ChatGPT checked for this on its own, but this is definitely a potential bug that you would want to consider. So finally, it selects two flavors from the flavors array and returns a string in my requested format: adjective, flavor. It also provides me with some example usage, which is great. So let's go ahead and call this function, run and open the console and see what we end up with. I want to make sure that I am logging out the result of this function. Let's run again. We get sour grapefruit orange, tangy orange grapefruit, cool orange grapefruit. So it looks like we're getting the result we expected, which is great. But now I want ChatGPT to generate me some fun flavor ideas. So next I prompted, please generate 20 sweet or dessert-like foods for the flavors array. I'm again going to give it some examples like cake, pineapple, and whipped cream. Then I say generate 20 wacky and fun adjectives for the adjective array. For example, tart, fresh, and smoky. Keep in mind that this prompt is based on the fact that I have just in the last interaction asked ChatGPT to generate a function for me, so I'm not referring to that function. I'm counting on it to remember the code that we're talking about. But there are many instances where you might want to refer to the function as part of your prompt. So as you can see, it gives me a list, but that's not what I want. I want to be a lazy programmer and I want these as arrays. I don't want to turn them into arrays myself. So I'm going to update my prompt and be a little more specific and deliberate. So I'm going to explicitly say, please generate 2 JavaScript arrays. The first one, I want 20 sweet or dessert-like foods for the flavors array. And then I give my examples. And then number 2, 20 wacky and fun adjectives for the adjective array with some examples like buttery, luscious, and artisanal. This time it does exactly what I ask it to do. It gives me 20 flavors and 20 weird adjectives. Let's copy and paste these into the scrim. So I will replace these shorter arrays and let's run, see what we come up with. Whimsical banana whipped cream. Interesting. Zesty caramel cherry. Vibrant cherry mango. All right, so we've got the result that we wanted, but I see a little issue here. I want these flavors to be capitalized. Quickly, I'm going to say, please write a function that capitalizes each word in the seltzer flavor. This is something iterative and incremental. I'm again going to provide an example. So here is an all lowercase sour orange apple, and I want the first letter of each word to be uppercase. So it gives me this capitalized word function. So we'll copy and paste this code in right underneath our other function. And it did provide me with an example usage, but instead of using that, I'm going to come down here and I'm going to wrap my suggest new flavor function into this capitalized word function. And that's how we'll test to see if it works. I'll run zippy cake cinnamon, interesting flavor. And with that, my seltzer water generator is complete. Showing versus telling and using examples when it comes to working with ChatGPT is incredibly valuable. It's a great skill to learn. So thanks for practicing with me. Hope you enjoy it. Let's continue on to the next prompt engineering tip. In earlier scrims, I talked a little bit about the dangers of ChatGPT hallucinating. Hallucinating is language models' tendency to sometimes simply make things up, things that can sound perfectly plausible and true, but just aren't. ChatGPT can rather randomly make up facts, misquote people, or give false information. So what I'd like to do in this scrim is show you an example of a time that ChatGPT hallucinated while I was trying to work with it, as well as talk about why GPT hallucinates and what you can do if it hallucinates or how to try to prevent it from happening. So one day I was working with ChatGPT to create an interactive timeline, which is basically a web graphic that you can click on. It will show certain years on a timeline, and you can click on that year for more information. When I asked ChatGPT to help me with this, it immediately gave me an accordion menu, which was not exactly what I wanted. So here was my follow-up prompt. What suggestions do you have for a more dynamic user interface? I was hoping for something a little more graphically interesting than a simple accordion menu. Notice that my prompt is not very specific. It's pretty open-ended, and it's almost like I'm asking the language model to tell me what it thinks. Like I'm asking it for its opinion rather than requesting it perform a concrete task. And I think that might be one of the reasons that it began to hallucinate. So its response was, for a more dynamic and visually appealing user interface, I suggest using a horizontal timeline layout with a sliding effect. So what it's suggesting is something that is a photo carousel where you can cycle through a collection of photos or other information by clicking on right and left arrows. So it suggests this open source library called ChronoSlider. Notice it even gives me the GitHub URL, and it claims that this library is lightweight and very easy to integrate. It then gives me instructions and sample code, but guess what? When when I go to this GitHub link, I get a 404. It doesn't exist. When ChatGPT does make mistakes, it can be pretty good at correcting itself. So I'm going to ask it to confirm its own information. My next prompt was, I get a 404 error when I try to visit the ChronoSlider GitHub repository. Can you check the URL? And then ChatGPT is like, oh, apologies for the confusion. I made an error in my response. It seems that the ChronoSlider library does not exist. And then it suggests another library which does in fact exist. And not only does it exist, but it turns out to be a little closer to what I was actually looking for. So that's what happened. ChatGPT completely fabricated a library and instructions for how to use it. Let's talk about why this happens. Why do language models hallucinate? It can be for a few reasons. It can be limited or incorrect training data, a misinterpretation of your prompt, or, and probably most likely for the example that I went through, it has to do with the way GPT works. I've heard GPT described as an incredibly sophisticated autocorrect. Basically, the way that it comes up with responses is that it tries to determine the likelihood of the next word given a sequence of words. So it's trying to optimize and guess what the next word is going to be, and that sometimes causes the model to prioritize coherence over correctness. In other words, it will occasionally pick something that sounds good over something that's actually true. At this point, I have spent many hundreds of hours with ChatGPT, and it's only hallucinated a few times to my knowledge. So this isn't an error that happens constantly, but it is something that is helpful to be aware of. Here are some things you can do when ChatGPT hallucinates. As I showed you, you can prompt the model to double check its response, and or you can confirm the response for yourself. Sometimes it can be good to do both. Breaking questions or tasks into smaller chunks can be really helpful, and it's been shown that the smaller that you break down the tasks, the more accurate the response. Whether that means into smaller prompts or breaking stuff down into lists of things, as well as encouraging the model to show its own work or justify the choices that it's making. In the context of code, as we'll see later, sometimes that can mean add code comments explaining what you've done and why you've chosen to do it that way. And then finally, you can rephrase the question to ask it in a different way, be more specific, or provide more context. So those are some tips to mitigate ChatGPT hallucinating. ChatGPT is an amazing tool that if you remain just a little bit critical of the information that it's giving you. Congratulations! Go ahead and give yourself a nice pat on the back because you've learned a number of strategies for more effective prompt engineering. In this section, we covered how to refine prompts with specificity, context, and technical language. We've learned how to gain more refined control over the length and formatting of the AI's responses. We've covered breaking down tasks and prompting iteratively, optimizing prompts, role-based prompting, and prompting by example. I've included in this scrim a markdown file with a lot of the examples that we covered, and you can go ahead and use this as a reference. If you'd like to save it, you can click on this little gear here and download the file as a zip. You can then open it up in a text editor like VS Code. Next up, in the next section of the course, we'll go over ideas and strategies for using AI to accelerate your coding workflow. I'll see you there. Now that we've gotten comfortable with all the facets of effective prompt engineering, let's explore some ways AI language models can help you be a faster and more effective developer. Here's just a short list of some of the ways you can use AI for web development. You can use it to generate project ideas, plan projects, write user stories, and even Jira tickets. You can generate code and code snippets, generate mock data, debug, get code review and suggestions for refactor, convert code from one format to another, like from Python to JavaScript, for example. You can write tests and documentation and find that you can learn new technologies and advanced topics faster than ever before. In this next section of the course, I'm going to show you a wealth of examples and ideas for how you can use prompt engineering to generate code in a precise and incremental way, as well as how to use AI to explore, learn, and study web development topics. So let's go, let's do it. As we've seen in previous scrims, you can accomplish a lot with a well-crafted prompt by describing in detail exactly what the code should accomplish. Generating code from pseudocode is another effective strategy to maximize your specificity and fine-tune your results. Pseudocode is an informal way to describe what your code should do in plain English, and that could mean a bulleted list of procedural steps or very simplified code that doesn't follow the syntax of any particular language. And this tip is going to be especially helpful if you're wanting to accomplish accomplish a coding task in a specific way, if you're trying to generate code in a language you're unfamiliar with, or if you simply want to code without worrying about precise syntax. So let me show you an example. Let's say I wanted to write a function to find a book in a book array by the book's ID. My prompt will look something like this. I'll start by specifying that I want the prompt to be written in JavaScript. Now I'll go ahead and start my pseudocode with something that pretty much looks like JavaScript. I'll say I want to take two arguments, a book array, and an ID. But now instead of writing a function, I'm just going to do some quick pseudocode. So I'll say for each book in the book array, if book.id equals the ID that we're passing into the function, then return that book from the array. Else, return an error object with a message, no book found. That's my prompt, and here is the result. As you can see, this is pretty much exactly what I asked for. We are looping through the book array. We're comparing each book ID to the ID that we're passing into the function, and if they match, we're returning that book, and if we don't find a match, we're returning an error object, no book found. I then want to be able to test this function, so I'm going to write another quick prompt. That is, just generate some funny book mock data to test this function. ChatGPT returns some fun book data, and I can test my function by passing in this books array and an ID of 5. So let's run and open up the console. And that results in the book with an ID of 5, so we know that this function is working great. So that's one method of pseudocode that we can do. Just basically it looks like code, but with no formal syntax. But I can also write pseudocode that is a little more conversational. So for example, here is another prompt where I'm basically asking for the same thing in a longer form. Write a JavaScript function, find book by ID. So I'm calling it find book by ID instead of get book this time. And this function should take two arguments, book array and the ID. For each book in the book array, compare each book array ID with the passed in ID. If found, return book. If not found, return error object. Sorry, no book found. I'll copy and paste the function that ChatGPT generates. And as you can see, it is almost exactly the same. We're looping through the books, comparing the IDs, returning the book if we find it, and returning an error if we don't find it. I'll call this function with the same array of books. Let's try a different number. How about book number 4? Great. And let's try it if we enter a book ID that doesn't exist. We get an error message. Perfect. We've covered in this scrim how you can quickly create and test a function using pseudocode to more finely control the output. If you'd like some practice here in index.js, I have a few suggestions for functions you can prompt AI to generate with pseudocode. So you'll want to write detailed pseudocode for the following functions and prompt ChatGPT to write those functions for you. We have a function that adds two numbers, a function that adds all the numbers in an array, a function that looks for a user ID in a user array and returns an error if not found, a function to count vowels in a string, and a function that finds the highest number in an array. Go ahead and practice prompting with pseudocode if you want to. And as I said before, this is a really helpful strategy if you're trying to generate code in a language you aren't familiar with, if you want to have more control over how a function is written, or maybe you're still new to coding and want to work through the logic yourself and not have the AI do too much work. For precise communication with ChatGPT, you can create a pseudo language, which is basically an agreement that you are going to prompt ChatGPT in a certain way and you expect it to respond in a certain way. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to come over here to this counter MD file. And here is the prompt that I shared with ChatGPT. I want to build my own React component library with common components like form fields, nav bars, and an accordion menu. Then I break down two instructions, create a pseudo language similar to Markdown that will help me quickly describe a React component so that you can convert it to example code. Respond with the template I can use as well as an example component. Keep the template and the component as simple as possible. I added this last line here because in my experimentation, ChatGPT did tend to overcomplicate things. Here's the template it gave me. This is our agreement of how I'm going to define React components so that ChatGPT can provide me with the code for these components. I'm going to name the component. I'm going to define its state, props, what it should render, and the event handlers that it has in this format. Under state, I'll define any and all state variables with their initial values. Under props, I'll list all the props that my components will take with the prop type. I'll describe what I want the component to render, and I'll list event handlers with the handler name and the description of what the handler should do. Here is the example that ChatGPT provided for me. So it gave me a simple counter example. We're going to keep track of one piece of state called count with an initial value of 0. As a prop, we're going to take in an increment value, which is a number, the increment of the count. So instead of incrementing by 1, we could increment by 5 or 10 or 15 or 7 or whatever we want to do. The component should render a button that displays the current count, and each click increases the count by the increment value, which is the prop that our component is taking in. Finally, we have an event handler called handle increment, and that increases the count state by the increment value. This is a fairly detailed description of what we want this component to do, so let's see how it works. I'll go to my counter.jsx file. Here's the code ChatGPT generated. I'll go to index.js and we'll import this component. Finally, we'll render it in our app component and run and see if it works. Excellent. We have established a pseudo language with ChatGPT to describe in detail the components that we want to build. This does have its limitations. ChatGPT is only going to remember this agreement for so long, so you will have to periodically remind it, but this is just one more way that you can communicate with ChatGPT with precision. Let's try creating another component. I'm going to go to my navbar markdown file and copy and paste in my pseudo language template. I want to fill this out so that I can prompt ChatGPT to create a simple navigation bar for me. Before I show you how I filled this out, I'd encourage you to pause the scrim for a second and fill this out yourself. Think about how you would describe how to build a nav bar. You can copy and paste this into ChatGPT and say, hey, this is the pseudo language I want to use to create React components, and I want you to create a nav bar component. Pause the scrim now, and when you're ready, come back and I'll show you how I did it. Welcome back. I hope you found that educational. Let me show you how I approach this. I'm going to start with my render statement because for me, it makes sense to describe first what I want the component to do. So I'm going to say that the component accepts an array of objects, each representing a link in the nav menu. I want each object to contain the URL name. And I'll give an example here like home, about, or contact us, etc. And of course, we want the URL. We want our navbar component to render the list of links. I know I want to keep track of which link is currently active, so I'm going to have a piece of state called active link, and that's going to keep track of the index of the menu item, so I want the initial value to be 0. I want my navbar to take in an array of link objects, as I've specified here. I'm going to refer to that as nav links, and the prop type will be object. Then I'll handle clicks on the link. And when a nav menu item is clicked, I want its index to become the active link. A better way to say this might be update active link with nav menu item index. Let's look at the code that resulted from this prompt. I'll go to my navbar.jsx file and paste it in. We have this navbar, which is pretty much exactly what I described. It loops through an array of navlink objects, and for each renders a list item with the link, which when clicked sets that link to active. Let's import this into app.js and try it out. Before we can test it out, we're going to have to come up with some links to pass as a prop to the navbar. I prompted GPT to generate this for us. I asked it for some learning to code themed links. Here's what it came up with. We'll pass the navlinks array of objects to navbar as a prop. Just like that, run. Here's a simple navbar that we generated using a pseudo language with ChatGPT. This could use some styling, of course, but I think it's a pretty good start. Welcome to another challenge where you are going to develop a pseudo language with ChatGPT to help you generate forms. First, you'll prompt ChatGPT to create a pseudo language for creating HTML forms. And secondly, if you like the suggestions, go ahead and use the pseudo language to create a form. You can ask for adjustments if necessary, and if the pseudo language it comes up with is too complicated, reprompt with an instruction to keep it simple. I've noticed that this is an area where ChatGPT tends to want to provide you with a very comprehensive solution that's going to account for everything you might might possibly want to do with the pseudo language, which is great. But for the purpose of this exercise, we want to keep it as simple as possible. So it might be beneficial for you to instruct ChatGPT to go for simplicity. Go ahead and pause now and start working on the challenge. Welcome back. I hope that went well for you. Here is my prompt. Create a pseudo language that will help me quickly describe to you how to provide sample code and styles for an HTML form. Respond with the template I can use as well as a sample element. Here is the pseudo language that ChatGPT came up with. So we have a form, we can specify an action, a method, and the types of inputs that we want. And within inputs, we can specify a type, label, any attributes, and styles. And down here, you can see we can also specify styles for the form itself. So this looks pretty good to me. I'm now going to scroll down a little bit and I'll show you the example that it gave me. So we have a form where the action is submit form. We're going to post and it has a text input for a username and a submit button, and then also some styles to give it a border. I'll show you the result when I use this pseudo language to make a prompt that I fed right back to ChatGPT. I'm going to go to the index.html and I'll go ahead and paste my form code here. And into my CSS file, I will paste the CSS. Let's go ahead and run and test this out. And there we go. A nice simple little form in just a few steps. Using this strategy, you can create a session with ChatGPT where you can use this template over and over to quickly and precisely create a number of web components. Just keep in mind that ChatGPT's memory is short and you may need to remind it of your template after every 7 or 10 interactions or so. Thank you for trying out this challenge. Fantastic work. There's a lot to think about when you're writing a function. There's so many edge cases that you need to account for, and it can take a lot of practice to be able to identify what those edge cases are. Luckily, this is something that ChatGPT really excels at. We can use it to identify edge cases and generate inputs so that you can test your function against those edge cases. This strategy can be super informative and educational, especially if you're new to programming. So let's take a look. Starting in my remove dupes MD file, I'm first going to prompt ChatGPT to write a JavaScript function that takes in an array and returns a new array with any duplicate items removed. I'll now jump to my remove dupes.js file, and here's what that function looks like. The function is creating a set out of the array because set automatically removes duplicates, and then we're turning it back into an array using array.from. So basically, we're going to pass the array into set. Set removes all the duplicates. Then we're converting it back into an array and saving it to a variable called unique array, and then returning that array where all the duplicates are removed. Returning to remove dupes, let me show you my second prompt, and that is list 8 edge cases this function should account for and provide test cases for each. You may want to ask it for all the edge cases or however many edge cases you want. I specify 8 edge cases just to keep it from going on and on and on. This is GPT's response, and it did include a definition of each, which I erased just for the sake of brevity. So the edge cases we want to account for are an empty array, an array with a single element, an array with all elements that are the same, an array with different types of elements like numbers, strings, and booleans, an array with nested arrays. ChatGPT sort of disclaims here that the function that it gave us won't work as expected because JavaScript only allows comparisons of simple data types. So if we wanted to check for duplicate arrays, we would need another solution. The sixth case is an array with objects, then a non-array, dealing with what the function should do if it receives an input that's not an array at all, and finally arrays with special numbers like not a number and infinity. It also included with this response an additional disclaimer. The function provided doesn't handle nested arrays, objects, or non-array inputs. That's just fine for our purposes. So let's return to remove dupes.js. Here I made an additional prompt because I wanted the output to be in a specific format. I asked for the edge cases in a single code block just for ease of copy and pasting, and I ask it to denote the edge cases as part of the console log. So here's an example of what I want each test for each edge case to look like. Before we call the function inside the console log with whatever our test case is, I want what we're testing for to be denoted as a string. Here are the test cases. As you can see, they're in exactly the format that I requested. That's great. So let's head to index.html really quick, and I'm going to add remove dupes.js as my script source. Let's return to remove dupes.js, run, and see how we go. And open the console. Here are all of our tests and our results. This is really helpful because if you take a look at an array with a single element, it's passing in a 1, and we can see that our result is an array with 1 inside of it. So we're dealing with that edge case as expected. But take a look at non-array inputs in which we're passing in a string, and you'll notice that we have two t's, a capital T and a lowercase t, which this function considers two different characters, so they are not considered duplicates. Depending on your purposes, that's an edge case that you might want to account for. Let's do one more example. I'm going to go up here to countfrequency.js and paste in a prompt as well as the function that ChatGPT responded with. So I prompted, write a JavaScript function that counts the frequency of characters in a string. This function creates an object. It checks through every character in a string. If it finds the character, it increments the character count by 1, and if it doesn't find it, it creates it in the char count object. What I'd like you to do is pause the scrim now and ask GPT for 5 edge cases and then test this function against those edge cases. When you return, I'll show you my prompt and output. I'll see you in a sec. Welcome back. Hope it went well. Here is my prompt. My prompt is, what are 5 edge cases this function should account for? Please list the edge cases followed by a single code block with tests for those edge cases. Here's what it came up with. Because I have already requested a similar task, ChatGPT is going to give me a very similar format to before, which is great. That's exactly what I want. You may have needed to tweak it a little bit, but that is completely okay. I'm going to return to index.html and change my script source to count frequency. Run and see our result. In the console, you can see the 5 test cases for these edge cases and their results. As I said, I think this strategy can be pretty helpful to almost anybody, but especially if you're new, this can be really, really educational. ChatGPT can really open your eyes to edge cases and things that your function might need to do that you may have never thought about. Definitely use this to your advantage and join me in the next scrim to talk a bit more about test cases. Language models can be extremely helpful when it comes to testing your code. It's great at coming up with random inputs with which to test your function. It can help you write tests using test suites like Jest, and can even help you refactor based on those tests. Here in my scrim, I have this password checker function. It checks if a password is valid, and a password is considered valid if it has 10 or more characters, includes at least 1 capital letter, and contains 1 special character, like a star, an ampersand, a $sign, or an exclamation point. Say I just wanted to call this function with a bunch of different inputs to get a feel for how it will handle different inputs. So I can ask for some really simple tests. Call the following function with 10 test inputs and console log the results. And then I have an example of what I want the console log to look like. I want to call the function with a random input, and I want a label that lets me know what input went into this function. And then of course I reference in my prompt the function that I want to test. Let's take a look at GPT's response. As you can see, it's made up 10 random passwords, some of which are valid and some of which are not. Let's open the console and run this, and we see the output of our various tests. As I said, GPT can also generate tests for specific test suites. And head over to my isEven.js file. We have this really simple function that takes in a number as an input and uses the modulus operator to divide it by 2 to determine whether or not it's even. If I wanted to generate some Jest tests for this, I can prompt to ChatGPT something like, please write 8 tests for this JS function using Jest. It spits out some functions using the Jest syntax, and also makes some really good assumptions about the types of input and edge cases that we should test this function with. For example, it tests with 0, with positive numbers, negative, even, and odd numbers, and so on. Now, say that I wanted to generate some tests that look like Jest, but I want to be able to run them quickly in my browser or in a scrim. To do that, I'll prompt, please write 10 tests for this function that look like Jest, but that I can run in my browser. And then I can reference the function that I want it to write the test for, and it responds, certainly, here's an approach for a very basic Jest-like testing setup that you can run in your browser's console. We have a test function that is going to run a test callback and print the result of each test with a check if it passes and an X if it doesn't pass. We'll take a closer look at this in a second. But it goes on to make a bunch of Jest-like tests for all sorts of inputs, decimals, negative decimals, positive even numbers, negative odd numbers, and even a string. And note down here that it says JavaScript is a dynamically typed language and does type coercion. So 12, the string, is coerced to 12, the number, which means that the string 12 will return true as our function is currently written. Let's have a closer look at the response in the scrim. Copy and paste it here. We have a couple of helper functions that help us to create a jest-like environment and a bunch of tests. So I'm going to go to my index.html. I'm going to make sure that the right script is uncommented. Then we can return to isEven and run these tests. All of our jest-like tests have passed, but once again, this draws my attention to the fact that the string 12 will be coerced into the number 12 and therefore will return true as my function is written. So based on the results of my tests, let's say that I decide that I actually don't want that to happen. I want my function to only accept numbers as input. So to GPT, I'm going to prompt, please refactor my isEven function so that string inputs are invalid. It suggests a couple of alternatives, one where it returns false if the input is not a number, and one that will throw an error if the input is not a number. With just a couple of prompts, I've been able to generate a test suite and refactor my function to cover more test cases based on the results of that test suite. I'm going to choose this first alternative, which will return false if the input is not a number. Let's go back to the scrim, and I'll comment out our old function and copy and paste in the new function. Let's run the tests again. And now this last test doesn't pass. Let's scroll down to this test, and I'm going to change this because I now expect that isEven will return false if the input is a string. And so I would expect that when isEven is called with the string, I would expect that to be false. Now I can run again, and all of my tests are passing. This has been a few ways that you can use a language model to generate all sorts of input data and tests, and also refactor quickly and with just a few prompts. In this little challenge, you'll jump in and use ChatGPT to test a function and generate some edge cases. Especially for you new developers out there, this is great practice getting familiar with all of the different possibilities your functions may need to account for. So here we have a small function that takes an array and a chunk size and returns a new array of subarrays for that chunk size. So here's a little example. We have this array containing the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. We ask for a chunk size of 2. So this function then splits up the array into 2 arrays with 2 items each. So the first thing I'd like you to do is go ahead and read through the function, make sure that you understand what it's doing, then ask ChatGPT to generate some test inputs for your function just so that you can make sure that it's working correctly. Then you'll ask ChatGPT for 5 edge cases. Go ahead and read through those edge cases that it generates and pick a couple that you want to revise your function to account for. Some of the things that may involve infinite loops, so don't jump right in running the edge cases. Be sure to read through them and revise the function first. Once you've chosen a couple of edge cases, you'll ask ChatGPT to revise the function based on those edge cases. And you'll want to make sure to instruct ChatGPT on how you would like to deal with those edge cases, whether that's returning human-friendly errors, or returning false, or returning one single error saying something went wrong. It's up to you how you would like to handle errors. So go ahead and pause now and start working through these steps. Welcome back. Let's go ahead and generate some test cases. I'm going to delete this example test case we have here. And my prompt was, call this function with 3 test inputs and console.log the results. And I included the function in my prompt. Here are the test cases that ChatGPT came up with. We have 3 test cases. The first is an array with 9 items, and we're asking for a chunk size of 3. And our expected output is that we split this array into 3 chunks of 3 items each. In the second, we have some strings, and we want a chunk size of 2. But since we have 5 items, we end up with 2 items being chunked together in an array and then 1 item by itself. And in the third test case, we're asking for a chunk size of 1, so each item in the array ends up in an array all by itself. So that looks good. Let's go ahead and now generate some edge cases. I'm going to scroll down so we have a little bit of room. And here was my prompt. Kept it simple. Generate 5 edge cases this function should account for. And again, I copied and pasted the function along with my prompt. ChatGPT suggested the following edge cases if the input array is is null or undefined, so if we get a null instead of an array, if the chunk size is 0 or negative, that's going to cause an infinite loop because if we look at our function, we're incrementing I by the size of our chunk each time, so it won't increment and we'll keep going and going and going. Not exactly what we want. And then finally, an edge case that we might need to account for is if the chunk size is null or is not a number. So for example, if we tried to input the string 2. So I can see from these edge cases that we're going to have a problem if this function is called with types we aren't expecting. If the first argument isn't an array, or if the second argument is anything but a positive integer. Based on that knowledge, here is the prompt that I gave ChatGPT to ask it to revise the function. My prompt was revise the function based on the edge cases above. And I'm saying above here because I am still in the same session with ChatGPT, so I can count on it knowing the function that I'm referring to. Throw a user-friendly error if the first argument is not an array or if the second argument is not a positive integer. So up here, I'm going to delete my old function and replace it with my revised function designed to deal with these edge cases. Let's run this with our current test cases. Looks like we're getting our expected results with this revised function, so that's great. Now let's scroll back down and uncomment these edge cases so we can test them one by one. The first argument is null. Let's go ahead and comment out these tests just so we can see clearly. The first comment is null, then we get the error the first argument must be an array. That's great. Let's test the second one. This is the one that was in danger of causing an infinite loop. So instead we get an error that says the second argument must be a positive integer. Great, that's what we want. Now let's test what happens if the chunk size or the second argument is null. We get the error about the second argument. We get that same error if we try to enter a string or anything that isn't a positive integer. In this scrim, you've practiced using ChatGPT to test and generate edge cases for a function. So really great job. I hope this will come in handy for the future. Perhaps you've already discovered in your experimentation with ChatGPT and other language models how easy it can be to find errors and bugs in your code. For example, I have this function here, and it takes in some information about blog previews, and it uses it to construct the HTML for a blog preview element. So as you can see, it takes in a parent ID, a card class, a title, and some content, and it makes HTML elements that look a little something like this. However, without having any idea what this function does, I could copy and paste it into ChatGPT and say, hey, ChatGPT, what's wrong with this function? And it will indeed come back with a list of everything that's wrong with the function, and it'll even correct the mistakes for you in an easily copy-pastable code block. Don't look at this for too long, it contains spoilers. This is a perfectly great strategy as long as your code isn't too complex. What I'm going to suggest to you in this scrim is a strategy to get language models to communicate with you about errors in a way that's going to let you better keep track of the changes that ChatGPT has made. So what I'd like you to do now is prompt GPT to fix the errors in this function by using these steps. First, run the function and copy and paste any error messages that you might get into ChatGPT along with the function. Then I'd like you to ask the AI to explain the errors to you as code comments. This can be a good thing to do because it helps you keep track of what's going on with your code, and also making ChatGPT break down the changes and explain them is going to help you minimize the chances that it will make a mistake. As we've discussed, the more you can break down a task, the better. So go ahead, pause the scrim now, and debug this function. Welcome back. Hopefully you have some nice blog previews in your mini browser. Let me show you what I prompted. So my prompt was, this function should return the HTML for a new blog preview post. So I'm being really clear about what I expect the function to do. And I go on to say, but instead I'm getting the following error, and I copy and paste my error. And then I followed with, please fix the errors and explain the fixes with code comments. ChatGPT responds with the following. I have a couple of problems in your code. Here is the corrected code. But rather than spitting out the corrected code or giving me paragraphs of explanation about what it changed, it's right here conveniently in the code comments. Let's have a look at this in the scrim. I'll go ahead and delete my old code and replace it with the new. So I know after taking a look at this that I forgot to call getElement by ID as a function, and I didn't pass anything into it. I was trying to append the content of the card incorrectly, and I had an error down here because of the way that I was incorrectly calling get element by ID. ChatGPT provided an extra paragraph explaining what happened. If you would like to pause and read that, you're welcome to. I actually found the code comments a little hard to read, so I amended my prompt a little bit. Right after please fix the errors and explain the fixes with code comments, I say comment out the old code rather than replacing it so I can better see how you fixed it. ChatGPT then responds first with a list of issues that it addressed. This is helpful for understanding the problem if you want to read through it. But let's see how this amendment changed ChatGPT's code output. I'm going to go ahead and replace my function again. Let's close the console. So now we have the old code. So this was our old line of code, and you see that we are assigning document.getElementID to this variable rather than calling getElementID. So then it explains the new code to me, calling document.getElementById with parent ID as an argument. So this is the corrected code. And this way we can compare the old code to the new code to really understand what happened. And these are just a few examples of how you can tweak your prompts just a little bit to get some really incremental and helpful information out of ChatGPT's responses. See you in the next scrim. AI can be so helpful at performing a variety of time-consuming, detailed rote tasks. And one of those tasks is code conversion. Let's look at a few examples. I can give the AI an API call and ask it to convert it to Python. I can convert from language to language. For example, this is an API call in JavaScript, and I'm asking ChatGPT to convert it to Python. And this is what that looks like. I can also, this is one of my favorites, convert CSS to Tailwind. I just have this blob of CSS as part of my prompt. ChatGPT spits out some Tailwind. This came in really handy recently when I was working on a project with Tailwind, and I just wanted to make a small change without having to learn it right away. Real-time saver. I can also convert CSS to a styled component in React. This is a really easy and often accurate conversion that I have found myself using a lot. You can also convert data from one format to another. So here I have a CSV file about sitcoms from the 90s, and I want ChatGPT to convert it to JSON. Note that I do have to give it some instructions so that the JSON looks how I want it to. So I instruct it to lowercase and concat the headers. These are the headers: title, main actors, year, and average rating. And if it is 2 words, I have asked ChatGPT to convert it to one snake-cased word. I've also requested that it convert the main actors column to an array. So I want an array of actors. And I've also specified a type that I want for the year and average rating columns. And note that this is also serving as an example of what I want the column names to be. And quick as a flash, I have converted the data to JSON with the specified property names and types. To review, here are some of the ways that you can use AI to convert code from one thing to another. You can do language to language, like JavaScript to Python, file to file format, like CSV to Markdown or to JSON, framework to framework, like converting a React component to Vue. This can be really helpful if you're trying to pick up a new framework. Maybe you have a piece of React code that you're really familiar with, and you want to see what that looks like converted to Vue so you can start to use Vue. There's a lot of possibilities here. And then, of course, my favorite, ChatGPT 4 in particular, is a really great CSS converter. CSS to SCSS or to Sass or to Tailwind or styled components. Again, a lot of stuff you can do. I'm sure there are a lot more ways that you can use this capability, so keep this in mind as you're considering ways to make your development tasks faster. Here I have a little application that ideally, when you click on this blast off button, will count down from 3 and send this little rocket blasting off into space. Unfortunately, the spaceship can't launch because it's programmed in jQuery and Tailwind, which our scrim is not currently set up to handle. So here's your task. You'll want to prompt ChatGPT to convert the jQuery to plain JavaScript and the Tailwind code in index.css to plain CSS. Then you'll click blast off to see if the button works, and if you've converted it successfully, clicking the blast off button should start a countdown timer, and the rocket ship should take off when the countdown reaches 0. Go ahead and pause the scrim now and work on this challenge. Welcome back. Hopefully you have liftoff. Here was my prompt to convert the jQuery to plain JavaScript. Pretty simple. Please convert this jQuery to plain JavaScript. and then I copied and pasted the jQuery code in with my prompt. I'll go ahead and replace my jQuery with my converted plain JavaScript code. We're selecting various elements in our HTML, adding an event listener, which starts a countdown on click, and also calls this rocket blast function, which uses the transform property to move the rocket off screen. That looks good. Let's now go to our index.css and convert this Tailwind code. My prompt here was also pretty straightforward. Please convert this Tailwind code into an external CSS style sheet. I'll go ahead and replace this Tailwind with my output from ChatGPT. So you'll see that it has styled everything nicely for me. And now this should work. So let's click run and the blast off button to see if this works. 3, 2, 1, 0. We have liftoff, which means we've used ChatGPT to successfully convert the code. Great work. It might seem like there's not too much to say about documenting code with AI. You can use ChatGPT to document a function or other small bits of code simply by copying and pasting the code into the prompt and saying, hey, document this. For example, take this little function that creates SEO-friendly slugs. If you're not familiar, a slug is a unique identifier for a link to a web page. And if it's optimized for SEO, it uses keywords and is often quite descriptive. Here is our AI-generated documentation. And as you can see, this function takes the title of the web page and converts it to a slug. You can see down here in this little example that if you pass it the string hello world, it's going to return hello world with no capitalization and a hyphen between it. And this would become part of a URL to uniquely identify the hello world page. So with ChatGPT, you can request specific formats of documentation, like we've requested JS doc, and so it's going to document the parameters that the function takes, as well as a description of what it returns and its type. It also really neatly describes everything that the function is doing. So it converts the title to lowercase, it trims the leading and trailing white space, it replaces symbols and other non-alphanumeric characters like commas or quotation marks with hyphens, and finally it removes any leading or trailing hyphens. So that is some nice, thorough AI-generated documentation. Another example of a specific format you could ask for documentation is prompting GPT with a React component and asking, how do I document this using Storybook? And then ChatGPT will provide you with some boilerplate code, and you can start having a conversation with it about how you might do that. So documentation is pretty much as easy as asking for it. So AI and language models really excel at helping you create all sorts of different types of documentation, mostly for smaller bits of code like isolated functions and the like. But here's a fun little strategy for when you have a longer piece of documentation you'd like AI to help you with. I'm going to prompt ChatGPT to interview me about my thoughts and opinions on style conventions and best practices, and I'm going to have it use my answers to generate a style guide. So my prompt is, I want to create a simple JavaScript style guide. Ask me 10 questions about best practices and style conventions, and use my answers to write a style guide. ChatGPT says, great, here are some questions. It asked me 10 numbered questions. So pretty standard stuff like, do you prefer const and let over var? Should we use semicolons? What maximum line length do you prefer? Single quotes, double quotes, the dreaded tabs or spaces debate, arrow functions, and so on. So the way I'm going to answer this is I'm going to create my own list from 1 through 10 and answer each. And notice that there are places in my answer where I defer to the wisdom of others. So for questions 5 and 6, I say use whatever is in GitHub style guide. And for number 9, which is what is your position on trailing commas and objects and array literals, I'm just going to say go ahead and use whatever is in Google style guide. Keeping in mind that this will be information from ChatGPT's cutoff in 2021. It is pretty cool though that I'm able to pull in other sources here to create my own style guide. Here is the response to my answers. It's my own little style guide, and now that I have this file, I could ask ChatGPT to convert it to Markdown or something so that I could put it on GitHub. Although fair warning, it doesn't do Markdown perfectly because the response text is already formatting and that tends to cause issues. But the point is that in just a few minutes, I've generated at least a starter document for a project that most likely would have taken me much longer if I were doing it manually. Or maybe if I worked for a small team at a busy startup, I may not have ever documented anything at all. As a developer, I've spent probably years of my life poring over code that is minimally documented or not documented at all. So let's all keep this tool in mind and put those days behind us. Happy documenting. AI can be a really powerful tool for learning in a personalized and interactive way. In this scrim, we'll talk over a few quick tips on how to use a language model like ChatGPT to learn a new topic or technology, as well as create highly tailored learning experiences. So, for example, you can use ChatGPT to summarize and explain info in a variety of ways, find learning resources, create a study guide and or a study schedule, and also to test yourself. So let's go over these one by one and look at some examples. As far as explanations and summaries go, my advice is to start broad by asking ChatGPT about a general topic, then drilling down into more and more detail. As you're exploring a topic, you can instruct ChatGPT to summarize information and provide explanations by specific audience, by specific experience or skill level, or by asking for metaphors and specific examples. So let's say I've been studying JavaScript and I'm ready to tackle more advanced topics. I can prompt something like, please suggest 4 advanced JavaScript topics that every junior or intermediate developer should study. The result is a long list of advanced JavaScript topics that I can study, like asynchronous programming, advanced DOM manipulation, design patterns, functional programming, a whole bunch of stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and pick one. Let's concentrate on async programming. Here in the explanatory paragraph, it says, familiarize yourself with concepts like callbacks, promises, and async await. So I'll just start with, please tell me more about callbacks. Explain the concept as if I'm a beginner and include a code sample. So I'm requesting a specific audience and a specific example. We get a nice explanation of callbacks that is relatively simple and jargon-free, along with a couple of simple examples. Let's say I read through this explanation and I still don't quite grasp it. I can ask ChatGPT to use a metaphor or provide use cases. I still don't quite understand. Can you explain callbacks using a metaphor, and can you provide a couple more use cases? The AI comes up with this metaphor of a waiter in a restaurant being like a callback. You can go ahead and pause the scrim if you'd like to read through this. And then it gives us a couple more examples like reading a file asynchronously and making an API call. But what if I really still don't quite understand? Or more realistically, what if I want to start with the shortest, most simplified conceptual explanation that I could get? One strategy is to ask ChatGPT to explain something to you like you're 5, which is a really popular thing to do on Reddit. There's a whole subreddit called Explain to Me Like I'm 5. So I'll prompt, please explain JavaScript callback functions to me as if I'm 5 years old. AI comes up with this example about you're a kid playing with your toys. You can go ahead and pause if you'd like to read through it. Another helpful strategy is to ask for an explanation based on a specific audience or skill level or persona or all three, as in this example. You are a senior engineer and I am a junior engineer. Please explain JavaScript promises to me in detail. So you'll notice that if you pause and read through this example, the result is a quite long and detailed explanation of promises that is more technical and detailed than the explanations that we've gotten so far, because we've been really specific about our skill level and the skill level of the persona that we want to have explain the concept to us. This prompting strategy can be really helpful for learning, especially if you're a person like me who needs a variety of different explanations to really grasp a new subject. Finally, you can ask for explanations using very specific examples. So say I want to learn more about JavaScript classes, but I don't want to look at another foobar or car example because they're so common. So I can prompt the AI, explain JavaScript classes to me using an example class called pet. Then I can get an explanation that gives me a pet example. Or if I want to have even more fun, I can say explain using mythical creatures like dragons and unicorns. And ChatGPT explains classes to me using this mythical creature class, where we create dragons and unicorns named Smaug and Twilight. Just a way to keep it fun, especially if you're not a big fan of arbitrary foobar examples. So that's it for this scrim. We've talked about how to learn with AI by exploring broad topics and drilling down, asking for summaries, and to explain info in a variety of ways. Now join me in the next scrim to discover more ways to learn with ChatGPT, including how to find learning resources, create study guides, and test your knowledge. Welcome back. We've talked about strategies for getting info from ChatGPT in a more personalized and tailored way. Now let's talk about a few more ways that you can use ChatGPT for learning. This includes finding learning resources, creating a study guide or a study schedule, or using the AI to test your knowledge. You can use AI to find articles, blogs, YouTube videos, and whole platforms like Scrimba, for example. Just about anything you're interested in learning. So for example, I could prompt something like list 5 great articles I can read to understand dynamic programming. This can be any number of articles and any topic. Another thing you could do is prompt for articles that are targeted towards beginner or intermediate or advanced learners on a certain topic. So asking for articles will yield not only the links but short summaries of the articles, which can come in very handy, and it's not necessarily something that you could get from Googling. Or I could ask for YouTube videos or forum posts or book recommendations, and again get a list with some links. I could also ask for a mix of videos, forum posts, blogs, basically whatever I want. You could argue that this is a lot like Googling, but I think first of all, it's nice to have all this information in one place, and I think it's a little easier to tailor your list of learning materials to your specific needs and skill level without having to do a ton of searching. AI can also help you structure your learning. For example, I can use it to create a study guide or a schedule. So here I'm prompting, write me a study guide on TypeScript, including outside resources for further study. Assume I already have a strong grasp of JavaScript. So I'm requesting a topic, I'm providing more information about the kinds of information that I want, and I'm specifying a certain skill level or a certain level of knowledge. And it gives me this beautifully formatted study guide for TypeScript that is broken down by topic and subtopic. I also have some advanced topics, learning TypeScript with framework, some books, additional tips, and so on. Pretty useful. I can then follow up this prompt with something like, based on the study guide, please create a study schedule for me. Assume I want to spend about 10 hours a week studying the topic. For each study session, include the topics I should study, along with additional resources and practice exercises. And this gives me a really nice study plan broken down by week and by session, and also links to resources where I can read about these suggested topics. So this could come in really handy if you need to learn a new subject and you're not sure where to begin. This probably isn't going to replace a curated course or even a really good YouTube video, but it is a place to start if you just need a little bit of structure to your study. Now I have a warning. As you are seeking resources from ChatGPT or really any other language model, keep in mind that asking for resources, there's definitely a danger of the AI hallucinating, giving incorrect info, outdated sources, especially in the case of ChatGPT, because as we've discussed at the time of this recording, it only has access to information from November 2021 and nothing after that. There's also a danger, again, of hallucinating and completely making up non-existent sources. So just keep in mind that this strategy is a good place to start, but right now AI models are often too wrong, too unpredictable, and too outdated to be anything but a supplementary learning tool. So always take the time to fact check and seek out multiple sources. Now let's go to our final way to learn, and that is testing yourself. So this is as simple as prompting something like, I've been studying TypeScript generics. Quiz me on my knowledge. All we need is a specific topic and a request for a quiz. ChatGPT does exactly that. I could also say something like, give me 5 small coding problems to practice and test my knowledge of some topic such as higher order functions in JavaScript. And it generates some map, filter, and reduce problems that we could use for practice. So in the last couple of scrims, we've talked about the various ways that you can use AI to study web development, including strategies to get more specific and tailored responses, ways to create learning schedules, finding resources, using AI to help you structure your learning, and testing your knowledge. I hope you found this useful, and I'll see you in the next scrim. Time for a bit of review and practice. We've just talked about how you can use ChatGPT to study web development. And here's some of the stuff we covered. You can start with a broad topic and narrow it down. You can request explanations based on a specific audience, skill level, or experience level. You can request specific examples to help you better understand concepts. You can request learning resources like YouTube videos and articles. And finally, you can generate study plans and practice questions. Here's a quick opportunity for practice. I won't be going over the solution for this because it's going to be very particular to you. But what I'd like you to do is first ask ChatGPT to quiz you on your React knowledge based on your skill level. Keep going with your quiz until ChatGPT asks you a question that you're not sure about or don't know. Then go ahead and use the steps above to learn more about that topic until you feel confident giving an answer. ChatGPT is a really great tool for learning, so I do hope that you try this out, and I hope you find it very educational. A big part of front end development is learning and interacting with a variety of RESTful APIs. And using AI language models is a fun and interactive way to explore the possibilities. As I walk you through an example of how to explore APIs and generate API calls, we're going to switch it up a little bit and use Bard, which is Google's interactive AI. To go to Bard and try it out yourself, you can go ahead and click on this image and it will take you right to the site. So your first question might be, what is the difference between Bard and ChatGPT, and when might I use one versus the other? So here are some key differences. At the time of this recording, ChatGPT's training data, in other words, all the information that it has access to, stops in late 2021. In other words, anything that's happened since then, ChatGPT has no idea about. Bard, on the other hand, has access to up-to-date and current information. It's also said to excel at simplifying information and being conversational. There are a ton of ChatGPT versus Bard articles out there, so I'll let you make your own decision about that. But what we do know is that Bard has access to up-to-date current information, so it's great to use when you need to find out information that's timely. For example, I can ask it, what's the most popular front-end framework today? And it responds with, as of June 2023, and that is the year and month that I'm recording this scrim, the most popular front-end framework is React.js. And then it goes on to give us a bunch more relevant information. For this reason, Bard can be a great tool to explore API documentation because it's changing all the time and we want to make sure we have the most updated information. I unfortunately learned this the hard way by trying to ask ChatGPT questions about OpenAI's APIs. It gave me outdated information and I ended up spending a ton of time debugging. So all that said, let's use Bard to explore the GitHub API. Starting off, here's an important tip. When you're using Bard, you'll get the best results if you're very direct about telling it exactly what you'd like it to do. So I started off by prompting, I want to explore the GitHub API. What are 10 endpoints I can access? And Bard responds, I'm not able to help with that as I'm only a language model. I think maybe what hangs it up is the fact that I sort of asked if I can access 10 endpoints. So I'll revise my prompt a little bit and say, please help me explore the GitHub API. List 5 available endpoints and what information I can get from those endpoints. And as you can see, this time Bard is able to provide me with the list of endpoints to get information about repos, issues, pull requests, commits, and branches, and also lists what I can do with them. So the repos endpoint is useful for finding out what projects a user is working on. Issues can be useful for tracking the progress of a project and finding out about any bugs or problems, and so on. So now that I have an idea of what I can do, let's say that I want to get some issues from a specific repo. I'll ask Bard, please write an example API call showing how to retrieve issues from the core React repository. Then I'm going to specify that I want to use fetch because it does tend towards using the Axios library. Bard generates me an example API call, so let's paste it into the scrim and see how it works. So it's given me the URL to Facebook's React repo, set up my fetch options, gotten the response for me as JSON, and then it says I can do something with the issues. So for now, let's just console log the issues. See if this works. I'll run and open the console, and the response is a bunch of issues from the React code base. Bard goes on to say, here's an example of how the issues object can be used to display a list of issues. So here is some sample code that if I create a UL class called issues list, then I can loop through each issue, create an LI element, get the title of the issue, and append it to my UL. So let's do that. I'll get rid of my console log and replace it with some code to create a list. Then I'll make sure to grab this issues list that we're trying to append list items to. And in the body, I will create a UL with the class of issues list. Let's run and open up the mini browser. And in just a couple of seconds, we have written an API call to retrieve a list of issues from the React codebase and display them. Pretty cool. I can continue to explore the API by asking for different information from a different repo. So I'm going to say, show an example of how to request the star count of a repository from the GitHub API. Use freeCodeCamp's main repository as an example and also use fetch. This gives me an example API call for how to get the star count of any repository that I want, but also a specific repository to test this out. So let's do that. I'll go back to index.js and I'm going to comment out my first API call and we'll paste the new one in here and run. Go ahead and minimize this and we'll open up the console. And it looks like FreeCodeCamp has 368,000 stars. Impressive. So now that I've explored the API a little bit, I can start getting more specific and more complex about what I would like from the GitHub API. So this time I'll prompt, I would like to build a tool that interacts with the GitHub API where I can send a search term and get back the name, star count, and URL of the top 5 matching repositories with the most stars. Can you give me an example API call using JavaScript and the fetch API? Bard gives me an example function that takes in a search term, uses the GitHub API's search feature to search the repositories for my term, then grabs the first 5 and gets all the information from it and console logs it. So let's try out this code. I'll comment this out, paste in the new code, and then I'm going to need to call my function with a search term, which I'll do down here. Call this with the search term React, run and open the console back up again. And we get 5 repository names, star counts, and URLs. I do think we have a little bug here. I don't think that this is the top 5 with the most stars. I think this might be the first 5 that the API returned, but this is a good lesson in staying vigilant, paying attention to what the code is doing and making sure that you know how it works and that it's doing what you expect. That is how you can use a language model to start exploring an API. As you can see, it's not necessarily a good replacement for reading the documentation, but it is a fun and interactive way to get to know a new API and start using it right away. Have fun seeing what you can do with Bard and the GitHub API, and I will see you in the next scrim. Hello again. In my last traditional software engineering role, I had a wonderful coworker who I could go to with all of my questions about Git and GitHub. And that was great for me because version control can get so complex. Lucky for us, now everyone can have a version control expert right at their fingertips. And of course, that expert is ChatGPT. Let's look at a few examples of how ChatGPT can be a huge help with Git and GitHub. You can ask it to remind you of everyday commands, like what's the Git command to create a new branch? You can low-key ask it to explain version control concepts to you with prompts like, my tech lead has asked me to rebase my branch, but I don't know what that means. Can you explain? ChatGPT without judgment will say certainly and explain rebasing in as fine a detail as you require. You can ask questions about using version control with specific technologies, like how do I resolve merge conflicts using VS Code? And again, it'll give you step-by-step instructions for how to do that. You can ask it to help you problem solve specific scenarios, such as I want to open a pull request, but I only want certain commits to be a part of this pull request. What can I do? You can get as detailed and specific as you want, and ChatGPT is still going to help you out. So this prompt is very, very specific to my situation. I say, give me a step-by-step guide to submitting a PR for an open source project. I've cloned the repo locally. My branch is called blah, 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 fix broken link. And I want a PR into the main branch of a project called Super Awesome Project. As you can see down here, it's giving us some commands that are personalized to the information that we gave it. Very, very handy. Also notice that we have a very detailed step-by-step guide here that'll walk you through it in much more detail than maybe even a coworker would. This can make once intimidating tasks like trying to contribute to an open source project that much less intimidating. It can also help you write pull requests. If your workplace or the project that you're working on doesn't already have a process for how they want pull requests to be written, I find this to be a really helpful prompt. Ask me questions about my PR and use my answers to generate a PR description. It then generates 6 answers. What's the purpose of your pull request? What issue or feature does it address? What specific changes did you make? Are there any important considerations or instructions for reviewers? Have you tested your changes? And do you have any additional comments or information that would be helpful for the reviewers? So I answer each question one by one and enter that as a prompt. And here is a full pull request description in just a couple of minutes. It's a super time saver. So next time you have a question about version control, Git, or GitHub, keep ChatGPT in mind. See you later. So you finished an amazing project and now you need to figure out how you're going to get it up on the internet. This is another area where language models can be extremely helpful. Deploying is an area where the information tends to change quite a bit, so we're going to use Bard for this scrim to make sure that we have the most updated information on how to deploy. Let's say that I'm not even sure at first where I want to deploy my project or what I can even use. So I'm going to start with the prompt, list 5 services I can use to deploy a front-end project. We get back 5 suggestions here: Netlify, Vercel, Cloudflare Pages, GitHub Pages, and Surge.sh. Let's say I read all of these, and the ones that I'm most curious about are Vercel and GitHub Pages. I can then dig down a little deeper with the prompt, what are the benefits of deploying an application on Vercel versus GitHub Pages? So we can see quickly that Vercel has automatic deployments, free SSL certs, performance and integration things, where GitHub Pages has free hosting, a simple setup, and integration with GitHub, which makes it easy to manage the website from within GitHub. It then goes on to even create a helpful table comparing the two. So once I've made my decision, let's say I want to keep it simple and I want to use GitHub Pages. Now I can drill down even further with the prompt, please give me a step-by-step guide on how to deploy my project with GitHub Pages. So we get a full step-by-step breakdown with some additional details about each step. So I read through this, I get a little bit familiar with deploying to GitHub Pages, and now I'm asking myself, well, what if I have a React project? So I can ask for more information. My prompt is there anything special I need to do to deploy to GitHub Pages a React project versus an HTML, CSS, JS project? And Bard says yes, there are some things that you need to do, like building your files, configuring GitHub in a certain way, etc. So you can start to see how you can use a language model to get the sort of information that you're looking for. From here, I could ask the language model to tell me more about what a build process is, or more about how to configure, or really anything that I'm curious about. I'm just going to keep asking questions, and that's how I can sort of run my own investigation about the specific tasks that I'm trying to accomplish. Because Bard has access to the internet and more updated information, it's also good for asking about specific services. So say I have an old Heroku project, and I know that I had at one point deployed it using the CLI, but I can't quite remember how it works. And this is definitely a true story, something that's happened to me before. So I could say something like, list some commands I can use to interact with the Heroku CLI to deploy a project. And it'll remind me of all the things I can do. Very handy. I can also ask it for advice on comparing different deployment services. Like, for example, should I use Netlify Drop or Netlify Continuous Deployment? It explains what those two things are, provides a table that compares them, along with some advice about some additional things to consider when I make my choice. So let's say I choose continuous deployment with Netlify. I can then ask, how do I set that up? And again, it'll give me some really handy step-by-step instructions. I'd like to point out here too that you can use this technique not just for deployment, but for anything that you're unfamiliar with. The idea is to start broad and drill down into specific subjects as your needs require. Happy deploying. I'll see you in the next scrum. Let's talk about an important skill when using AI to assist with your coding, and that is knowing when to stop. AI tools like ChatGPT can be a huge help, but there comes a certain point where they can start getting in the way and becoming really frustrating. Let's go over a few examples. Number one, when you aren't getting the results you want after several iterations. If you've fine-tuned a prompt several times and simply aren't getting the results you're aiming for, it might be time to take a step back. Number two, this is a big one, when you no longer understand the code. If you're finding that the code generated by AI is so complex or convoluted that you're struggling to understand it, that is a really good signal to pause. Related to this is being caught in a cycle of what I like to call copy, paste, and pray. This is a term I use to describe the following scenario. You've had the AI generate code for you, and the code has some errors. You've asked AI about the errors, and the AI spits out more code, and that new code may or may not have fixed the original error, but has introduced a new error. So you ask it to fix that error, and before you know it, you're copying and pasting big swatches of code into the AI without a solid understanding of what the code is doing. A really good sign of this is if the AI is saying things like, apologies for the misunderstanding, or I see the problem now over and over again, but it's not actually helping you move forward. This is why I can't stress enough, it's really important to take the time to read and understand what any code you generate with AI is doing. It's really easy to get trapped in this loop. Another time it might be time to step back from AI is when the AI seems dumber than usual. Sometimes, for reasons I can't explain, an AI language model will just seem off. The answers might be off base, verbose, or less coherent than usual, or just missing the mark. And this could be due to many reasons, including the way that you're phrasing your prompts or some underlying issue with the AI. When this happens, best to give it a break. And lastly, when the AI seems forgetful. AI models like ChatGPT don't have a memory in the same way humans do. So if you notice the AI seems to be forgetting the context of your interaction or not following the logical sequence of a conversation, it might be time to prompt with reminders or the specific code that you're working for or asking for step-by-step instructions. So remember that AI is a tool, not a replacement for your own understanding and problem-solving skills. Take the time to read your code and know when it's time to take over as a human being and stop relying on the AI for help. Well done for finishing the second of 3 sections for this prompt engineering course. We've covered a lot of ideas and strategies for how to use AI language models in daily coding tasks to free up time and improve your productivity. We've learned that you can use AI to accomplish a huge number of tasks: to generate project ideas, plan projects, write user stories and Jira tickets, generate code and code snippets, generate mock data, debug, get refactor suggestions, convert code from one format to another, write tests and documentation, and learn new technologies and advanced topics faster. In the next and final section of this course, we'll talk about how to use AI to make job searching a little easier. Great work so far, and I'll see you in the next section. Hello again. This next section of the course covers a variety of tips and strategies for leveraging AI during a job search. We're going to cover ways to generate, learn, and practice common DS and algo problems, use role-based prompting to simulate a live coding interview, generate and practice behavioral interview questions, and write and personalize job docs such as resumes, cover letters, and elevator speeches. Come with me to learn how to use AI to tailor your resume, talk yourself up, and interview like a champ. The live coding interview is arguably one of the most intimidating aspects of becoming a developer. In these interviews, you have a limited amount of time to solve an algorithmic coding challenge while sharing your thought process aloud in front of another developer. For the next few scrims, we're going to talk about how AI can help beginners learn about, solve, and optimize easy level leet code style algorithmic coding challenges, as well as help you practice and improve live code interviewing skills. Before we start, I have a couple of small disclaimers. First of all, these strategies work much better with ChatGPT 4 and beyond. I've noticed that version 3.5 and below is much more prone to broad, unhelpful, or verbose answers, or misunderstanding what you want it to do, or simply giving you the solution even if you specifically ask it not to. So if you can and you want to follow along with me, I recommend using ChatGPT 4 or newer. My second disclaimer is that these strategies are also best for easy and maybe some medium level leet code questions, even for the newer versions of the language models. The more complex the problem, the more likely AI is to make mistakes and get things wrong. If you're a relative beginner at leet code style challenges, then this scrim is for you. So if your desire is to get better at data structure and algorithm problems, here are all the ways that you can use ChatGPT to learn and improve. Personally, yes, ChatGPT can just solve a challenge for you directly. You can definitely just dump an algorithmic coding challenge in ChatGPT and it will solve it for you, at least most of the easy and medium challenges. But it's my opinion that learning DS and algo problems with AI is best done iteratively and incrementally. So you can use AI to generate code challenges, generate pseudocode or step-by-step instructions for how to solve the code challenges. You can learn about and analyze sample solutions. And one of the most helpful things, in my opinion, you can use it to study common patterns for solving algo problems. More about that later. Let's start by asking ChatGPT to generate some algo problems for us. So my prompt is going to be, give me 3 easy level algorithmic coding interview problems. ChatGPT suggests these 3 problems: the two-sum problem, reversing a string, and palindrome number. I'm going to choose the two-sum problem as an example because it is fairly common and it's one of the first problems that you'll run into when you're studying leet code style problems. Now, because our goal for this course is much more about learning how to use AI to solve algo problems and not learning about any specific problem, I'm not going to go into too much detail about what the two-sum problem is and how it works and how you solve it. But I do have suggestions for how you can use AI to start to learn and familiarize yourself with these types of problems. First, I prompt ChatGPT for a short explanation. Explain the goal and solution of the two-sum problem to a beginner in 150 words or less. If this is a really new subject for you, I would recommend that you pause the video here and read through this. So go ahead and do that now if you need to. But here's the gist. Two-sum is an exercise where you look at an array of numbers and you want to find a pair of numbers that adds up to a target. So in this example, our target is 9. So we would want to write a function that looks at all of the numbers in the array and figures out if they add up to 9. This is easy to do by sight with a small array. 7 plus 2 is 9. And you'll notice that part of the problem is to find the indices of the two numbers. So the index of 2 is 0 and the index of 7 is 1. So we would want to write a function that returns 0, 1, the index of the two numbers that add up to the target. To understand this problem further, I could ask the AI to generate an explanation in a variety of tones, or ask it specifically to use example and metaphors. So I could write a prompt like, please explain the two-sum problem succinctly using a metaphor. It won't always come up with a great metaphor. This one is a little iffy, but it's basically uses the metaphor of trying to find two items at a yard sale that add up to exactly the amount of money that you have. If you're the type of person who learns best from real-world examples, you could also prompt something like, please explain the two-sum problem using a real-world scenario. So it says, imagine you're at a supermarket doing your grocery shopping. You're trying to stick to a budget and you only want to buy two items for dinner. You have $15 and your task is to find exactly two items that add up to $15. Of course, in real life, it might be okay if you went to the grocery store and only spent $14.97. But sometimes putting these types of problems that can feel a little arbitrary into a more real world scenario can help you with your understanding. So definitely something that is worth giving a try. So after you have taken some time to understand a certain LeetCode problem, you can also use the AI to start figuring out how to solve it. One of my favorite ways to do that is to ask for pseudocode. Pseudocode can mean step-by-step instructions for how to solve a problem, or it could be as detailed as something that looks like code but doesn't quite have the syntax of an actual programming language. And I'm going to show you an example of both. So my prompt is, give me pseudocode that will help me solve the following algorithmic coding problem. And I'm going to include as part of my prompt the problem statement for the two-sum problem. I'm going to ask that ChatGPT assume that I will use JavaScript to solve it, and I'm going to explicitly state that it should not give away the answer. This can be unpredictable. Sometimes it will do it anyway, especially if it is ChatGPT version 3.5 or below. ChatGPT responds with nice step-by-step instructions for how I can solve this problem. And if you'd like to read through the pseudocode, I have included it in this two-sum MD file. So I can ask for pseudocode, or I could ask the AI to generate and explain to me a variety of different solutions. So for example, I could prompt, walk me through a brute force solution and an optimized solution to the two-sum problem. A brute force solution is a solution that works but might take up a lot of computing space or take a long time to finish its process. In other words, it's a less efficient way to solve coding problem. This prompt is going to result in an explanation of the brute force solution of the two-sum problem, as well as some more minimalist pseudocode. Your results will of course vary on this, but in general, you should get an explanation of the approach as well as some sample code. And I should mention here that I got a little bit lucky because I didn't explicitly request pseudocode, because I wrote this prompt just a couple of steps after I had told ChatGPT not to give away the answer, but it probably would have been a stronger prompt to specifically state that I wanted a pseudocode, brute force, and optimized solution. So along with the brute force solution, it provides an optimized solution and some code. And if you'd like to take a closer look at that, I have also included it in the two-sum MD file. Yet another way to start to understand how to solve a LeetCode problem is to prompt for a solution in your language of choice with a line-by-line explanation of how it works. So my prompt is, generate a JavaScript solution to the two-sum problem and explain line by line in code comments how it works. And then I can look at a solution with some comments that will explain to me exactly what it's doing. Now, some of you might be saying, but Treasure, isn't this cheating? And that is definitely up for debate, but in my opinion, no. A lot of it is about learning the steps to problem solving or learning a trick to solve a specific problem. So I think that it's completely fine to look at a solution, but it can be really helpful to first set aside some time trying to figure out how to solve the problem without any help. At the end of the day, people who are successful at this type of interview generally are successful by solving similar problems over and over and over again, and it's mostly a skill that takes a lot of practice. In the next scrim, we'll go over more strategies to generate, learn, and practice algo problems. I'll see you there. To solve data structure and algorithm problems, it's really crucial to understand the different patterns and tricks and approaches for how to crack them. So, one pertinent question to ask might be, what are 5 common patterns I should be familiar with to get better at solving algorithmic coding challenges? ChatGPT comes back with a list of commonly used patterns and says getting better at solving algorithmic coding challenges often involves recognizing and applying some common patterns. Here are 5. The one we'll concentrate on is the sliding window pattern. And as it says here, this pattern is often used when dealing with arrays or lists where you're asked to find a subrange that satisfies a certain condition. So a good example of this would be if you're given an array and you need to find the sum of 3 items in that array that are right next to each other. The point here is that there are a lot of problems that you'll find on LeetCode and similar sites that can be solved using this sliding window pattern. If I wanted to get really comfortable with solving problems using the sliding window pattern, I could use ChatGPT to generate numerous example problems. And that's going to give me much finer control over my learning experience than I might get on a website dedicated to these sorts of problems. So I'm going to prompt, give me one example of a problem you can solve using the sliding window pattern. And that's going to give me a problem called maximum sum subarray of size k. And this is a version of the problem that I just described. Given an array of positive numbers and the positive integer k, find the maximum sum of any contiguous subarray of size k. It then goes on to explain step by step how you could solve this problem. But let's say that I have read this and found it jargony and a little hard to understand. It's fairly common for these types of questions to be jargony or obtusely worded. So to try to understand it a little better, I'm going to prompt, please restate the problem statement for beginners and avoid jargon. GPT says, sure, I'll break it down. So you have a list of numbers, for example, this array. Your task is to find the highest total you can get by adding up any 3 numbers that are right next to each other in the list. So you would add 2 plus 1 plus 5, 1 plus 5 plus 1, 5 plus 1 plus 3, until you've checked all combinations in the array and found the highest sum. So I can tell by looking at this that the highest sum of 3 numbers is probably going to be 9. And as you can see, it very helpfully walks you through this. So if you add up the first 3 numbers, you get 8. If you add up the last 3 numbers, you get 6. And the answer that we're looking for is the highest total. So if you add up 5, 1, and 3, you get 9, which is the highest possible total. So hopefully that makes a little bit more sense than find the maximum sum of any contiguous subarray of size k. I can also do the opposite and start with an algo problem, then ask what pattern I can use to solve it. Here I'm throwing into the AI an explanation of a problem that's pretty similar to the two-sum problem that we talked about in a previous scrim. And I'm prompting, what pattern can I use to solve the following algorithmic coding problem? The key difference in this problem statement is that we're dealing with a sorted array, meaning all the numbers are in ascending order. But we're still looking to add up 2 numbers in the array and see if they add up to a target sum, which in this case is 6. And we'll get back some information about an optimal pattern to solve this challenge, which is the 2 pointers pattern, as well as some instructions on how to go about it. If you want to learn more and take this a little further, I've included the problem statement for this sorted 2-sum problem here in the scrim. And here's what you can do to take it further. You can read through the explanation down here, and if necessary, ask for an explanation of the problem statement in a variety of tones with less jargon or with examples and metaphors, whatever you think is going to help you out the most. Then use the AI to generate pseudocode to help you solve the problem, ask about brute force and optimized solutions, ask ChatGPT to generate a solution and explain to you how it works, and ask for other problems that can be solved using the 2 pointers pattern. And this is kind of a good skeleton for a process that you can go through with any variety of LeetCode style challenges. For this challenge, you're going to use ChatGPT to generate and solve the simple classic FizzBuzz problem. What you'll do is ask ChatGPT to give you the FizzBuzz problem, and remember to specify that you do not want the solution because the second step is to attempt to solve it yourself. If you've already solved FizzBuzz in the past and you feel pretty comfortable with it, feel free to go through these steps using the problem of your choice. If you solve the problem, go ahead and ask ChatGPT for advice on how to improve your solution. And if you don't solve, ask ChatGPT to help you solve it using some of the techniques we've learned in earlier scrims. Go ahead and pause now and start working on the FizzBuzz challenge. Welcome back. I hope that you had a good experience solving the FizzBuzz problem. So I prompted ChatGPT to give me the FizzBuzz problem, and here is what it output. The instructions are to write a program that prints the numbers from 1 to 100. But for multiples of 3, instead of the number, print fizz, and for the multiples of 5, print buzz. For numbers which are multiples of both 3 and 5, print FizzBuzz. That's the classic FizzBuzz problem. Best of luck solving it. Thank you, ChatGPT. So here is my very quick solution to the FizzBuzz problem. It's a series of conditional statements. For every number between 1 and 100, we're going to check the number, and if it's divisible by 15, meaning it's divisible by both 3 and 5, we're going to print FizzBuzz. Else, if it's divisible by 3, we're going to print fizz, and if it's divisible by 5, we're going to print buzz. And if none of these conditions are true, we will simply print the number. Let's call this really quick so that we can make sure it works. Run and open up the console. And if you go ahead and scroll to the bottom, you'll see that it is working as expected. My next prompt was, how can I improve my solution so that it's more succinct and efficient? To which ChatGPT responded, your solution of the FizzBuzz problem is already quite good. The logic is clear and it's easy to follow. However, if you're looking to make it a tad more succinct without sacrificing readability, you might consider the following. So it suggests a solution in which we are keeping track of the output. So if the number is divisible by 3, then the output will be fizz. If it's divisible by 5, the output will be buzz. And if it's divisible by both, they'll be concatenated together into FizzBuzz. And then we'll console.log the output or the number if the output is an empty string. Because if the output is an empty string, that means that none of these conditions were met. I'm going to replace my old solution with the new one, and we'll uncomment and see if it works. Open the console, and if you scroll, this looks like it is working as expected. Great. ChatGPT did have one final comment, which was that the efficiency improvement here is minor since the complexity remains O of n. However, the solution is somewhat more concise. In this scrim, you've gotten some valuable practice using ChatGPT to generate and solve the simple classic FizzBuzz problem. Really great work. You are doing excellent. Especially if you aspire to work in big tech, learning about time and space efficiency in algorithmic and data structure focused coding problems is an unavoidable part of interviewing. So let's talk about Big O notation. If you're not familiar with Big O, it's beyond the scope of the scrim to teach it to you, but I can suggest a few ways you can leverage AI to start familiarizing yourself with the concept. For example, you can ask for a succinct, beginner focused explanation. Let's go ahead and read through this. Big O notation is a way to express how the time or space used by a program or algorithm grows relative to the size of the input. It provides a high-level understanding of which parts of your code might become bottlenecks as your data gets larger. You can also ask for a slightly longer explanation with some examples. Go ahead and pause here if you want to read through the explanation. Or you can ask for an explanation with specific JavaScript examples. Here are a couple of explanations. Pause now if you want to read through them. The shortest and simplest explanation of Big O is that it has to do with measuring how long it takes your function to run or how much space it takes up in computer memory. AI like ChatGPT can help you out not only by reviewing your DS and Algo code for efficiency, but by analyzing the time and space complexity of your solutions. Take this example. My prompt is, this is my solution to the two-sum problem. Please do a code review of the solution, analyze the time complexity, and provide suggestions for improvement. And I include a solution to the two-sum problem. ChatGPT outputs a nice little review here, comments on readability, correctness, efficiency, and code style. and makes suggestions for a more efficient solution. As you can see here under efficiency is where it says, here's where your code can be improved. Because as you may have noticed, my solution to the two-sum problem was a brute force solution. Basically, it uses nested loops to check every single element in the array, and ChatGPT's suggestion for a more efficient solution goes through the array and uses an object to keep track of the array items that we've already looked at. It's faster to look something up in an object because you can go straight to it without having to examine every single item in the array. So a prompt like this is one way you can use AI as a tool for code review. Just be aware that there may be some inaccuracies from time to time and that you'll probably want to seek review from human eyes as well. Here is another way you can learn about or familiarize yourself with Big O using ChatGPT. As we've seen, I can give ChatGPT a specific solution and ask it for a review, but another thing I can do is have it generate different solutions that I can study. So I can prompt something like this. Show me 3 example JavaScript solutions to the two-sum problem, each with a different time complexity. Include comments explaining each solution and its time complexity. This will give me 3 different solutions to the two-sum problem along with code samples. So I have a brute force solution, a solution using a hash map, and a solution where it first sorts the array and uses a method called two pointers to look through the array in a more efficient way. And just a reminder, at any time you can pause the scrim to look at these examples more closely. Asking for different solutions can be a really great thing to do once you've done the work of solving the problem yourself or have at least attempted to. And now you want to study different solutions so that you can become familiar with different approaches and how to talk about them, as well as becoming familiar with their time and space complexity and be able to talk about it in terms of Big O notation. Let's quickly go over what we've covered in the scrim, which is a variety of ways that you can use ChatGPT to review and analyze your code. You can use it to generate code reviews, to make general improvements, ask questions about efficiency, and to learn and study time and space complexity, and to start recognizing how to describe the time and space complexity of different solutions using Big O notation. You can also use ChatGPT to generate and study multiple solutions to the same DS and Algo problems and ask for solutions with different time and space complexities. Because a good way to become familiar with solutions in Big O is to look at a lot of solutions and a lot of examples. None of this will take the place of practicing these kind of problems. Really, the only way to master it is to practice solving a variety of questions over and over again. But AI might help you get there faster and contribute to a more well-rounded understanding of how to approach DS and Algo problems. What I have for you here is a problem statement and a solution to the palindrome number problem. Let's quickly read through the problem. Given an integer, write a function to determine if it is a palindrome. A palindrome is a number that remains the same when its digits are reversed. In other words, it reads the same backward and forward. Return true if the number is a palindrome, otherwise return false. So if we look at this solution, it basically takes a number, reverses it, then compares the original number with the reversed number. And if they are the same, it returns true because that means we have a palindrome, else it returns false, no palindrome. So down here, we are calling the isPalindrome function with the number 414. So if I run, it will return number is a palindrome. If I enter a random sequence of numbers and run, number is not a palindrome. What I'd like you to do with this is first you'll prompt ChatGPT to review the solution, describe its time and space complexity, and suggest improvements. And then ask ChatGPT to provide an explanation, an example for a more efficient solution. Go ahead and pause now and complete this practice. Welcome back. Hopefully you have a much improved version of this isPalindrome function. If you had a look at it, I'm sure that you may have noticed that we have some variables that don't have great names, and maybe some of the logic could be shorter. So let's see what ChatGPT came up with. I'm actually going to create a new file called code review MD so we can have a look at ChatGPT's response. My prompt that I came up with was, this is my solution to the palindrome number problem. Please do a code review, analyze the time complexity, and provide suggestions for improvement. And I made sure to include my isPalindrome function with the prompt. Here is ChatGPT's code review. Go ahead and pause now if you'd like to read through the whole thing. But basically, as I pointed out before, it says you could have some better variable names, you could rewrite your if-else block to be a little shorter, and that you should probably handle negative numbers. It also had some things to say about time complexity, but said your approach is already quite optimal for this problem. The improvements are more about readability and handling potential edge cases. Fair enough. So let me go ahead and go back to index.js. And we will replace the isPalindrome function with the improved solution that ChatGPT suggested. In my opinion, this is much easier to read. So first we're going to make sure that isPalindrome returns false if the input is a negative number. Then we'll set two variables, one for the original number and one for the reverse number. Do some work to reverse the digits of every number. And then finally, we'll compare the original number to the reverse number, and this equality operator will return true if these two variables are equal or false if they are not. Let's go ahead and try this out. I'm going to click run. We still have our jumble of numbers in here, and you can see that it said number is not a palindrome. Now let's try a palindrome just to make sure. We'll say 919. We'll run again. Number is a palindrome. So we have a nice little improved function that is working as expected. ChatGPT is extremely helpful when it comes to finding potential problems and inefficiencies in your code. So I really encourage you to use that to your advantage. Excellent work. The idea of using text-based AI to practice live code interviewing might seem a little strange, and sure, it's not going to be the same as practicing with a live person or come close to simulating the nail-biting experience of an actual live code interview, but it can definitely help, and that's what we're going to talk about in this scrim. In a live coding interview, you'll likely be expected to ask clarifying questions about the possible constraints and edge cases of the challenge, plan out a solution, and talk through the problem as you're solving it. So let's take a look at how AI can help you practice these activities via role-based prompting. To review role-based prompting, it's generally when you engineer a prompt that begins with act as a or you are a to encourage the AI model to take on a certain role. Here's a prompt designed to help you brainstorm some clarifying questions that you might ask during a live code interview. Act as if you were a developer in a live coding interview and you've been given the problem below, and ask me clarifying questions about the problem as if I am conducting the interview. We have this palindrome number problem, and this is basically a number that reads the same forward or backward. Here's an example of a palindrome number because forwards it is 121 and backwards it is 121. ChatGPT will generate a list of possible questions that you might ask an interviewer during a live interview. Some examples are, what should the function's behavior be with negative numbers? Since negative numbers have a negative sign in front of them, they won't read the same backwards. So should I assume that all negative numbers aren't palindromes? Good question. How should the function handle single digit numbers? How should the function deal with zero? What about large numbers? Should it return a Boolean value? And should I aim for a certain level of time or space complexity? The cool thing here is that after ChatGPT has generated these questions, I can then ask it to switch roles and answer these questions. So my prompt will be, now answer the above questions as if you are the interviewer. Assume the candidate is applying for an entry-level position. This will hopefully give us some ideas about questions an interviewer might ask based on the experience level of the interviewee. So here are some answers as if ChatGPT is the interviewer. That's a great point. Negative numbers are not palindromes. So you're correct that you can return false for any negative input. Then if we jump down to 6 here, we can see that probably because this is for an entry-level person, it says try to come up with the most efficient solution you can, but the most important thing is that it's correct. Once it's correct, you can think about optimizing for efficiency. In this way, you can create a back and forth with the AI where you're almost like a fly on the wall of an actual live coding interview. Of course, it's going to be hard to vouch for any kind of accuracy as far as these simulated interviews go, but it is really good for brainstorming and getting ideas of things that you might say and things that you might be asked. Here's another potential strategy. Based on the above exchange, write a script that models how an interviewee might successfully solve this problem while reasoning aloud and communicating well with the interviewer. GPT will then write you a whole script filled with things that an interviewee might say as part of a successful interview. So the conversation kind of picks up where it left off. The interviewer has clarified the answer to the interviewee's questions, and the interviewee says, all right, thanks for the clarifications. Now that we've established that we're only dealing with non-negative numbers, we can start to plan our solution. One way to check if a number is a palindrome is by reversing the number and then comparing the reversed number with the original number. And then they go on to talk about their initial approach, which you can pause if you want to read more about this. So this might not be the greatest or most accurate portrayal of how a person would talk to another person, but this is definitely an effective way to get tidbits of information or angles that maybe you wouldn't have thought of or haven't thought of before. So think of it as a good brainstorming tool. And those are some creative ways that you can use ChatGPT to help you get better at live code interviewing. How much do you love writing resumes and cover letters? If you're anything like me, probably not very much. Luckily, what better use for an AI language model than to generate words? You can use AI to write all sorts of job search docs. You can get help with writing resumes, cover letters, elevator pitches, or one of my favorites, using it to help you talk about your accomplishments. That said, it's good to keep in mind that AI, when it comes to writing job docs, especially resumes, it's a good starting place, but certainly not a destination. I would not recommend having AI fully write your resume, but you can use it to work on improving bits and pieces of it, which I'm going to show you today. So I'm going to use a couple of strategies here. I'm going to provide some context. I'm a front-end developer who needs a general resume. Then I'll do a role-based prompt, act as a resume writing expert, and ask me questions about my current job. Interview me as a resume writing expert, and then use my answers to create two resume sections, one about my work experience and the other about my technical expertise. ChatGPT will then ask me a few questions about my work experience, like my job title and what company I worked for, how long I've been there, my main responsibilities, key achievements, and what technology tools or languages that I used. And I find that this format of having AI ask you questions be really helpful if you kind of have blank screen syndrome, and when you sit down to write a resume, you're just kind of staring at the document, not knowing what to write. In this way, AI is a really good idea machine. So it then goes on to ask me about my technical expertise, and then I'm going to go ahead and make up some answers. So I was a front-end developer at Excellent Software Company for 2 years. Then you'll notice that I wasn't exactly sure how to answer this second question. Can you describe your main responsibilities? So I'll say, I want you to ask me more questions to help me describe my main responsibilities. I also asked for some help talking about my key achievements or projects that I'm proud of. I'm simply going to answer, I can't think of any. What are some examples based on my job title? So again, using AI as a brainstorming tool. Then I make up some stuff quickly for the technical questions, and ChatGPT says, great, thank you for the information. Let's dig a little deeper. So it asks me questions about my main responsibilities and key achievements. I go ahead and jot down some quick answers to these questions. And from our interview session, ChatGPT generates a section that I can put on my resume. I was a front-end developer at Excellent Software Company at these dates, and here are the things that I did based on the information that I gave the AI. So a lot of this sounds pretty good. Specialize in optimizing web pages for maximum speed and scalability, ensuring high quality graphic standards and brand consistency, leading code review processes, maintaining code quality and encouraging best practices, mentor interns, guiding them through technical processes, and providing valuable industry insights. Your own results will vary, and you'll definitely want to go through and personalize this, but look at all of the resume fodder that I was able to generate in just a couple of minutes. Super useful. It then gives me a list of key achievements and technical expertise, and like I said, you're probably going to have to work on the formatting and decide for yourself where you would want to put this information on your resume, but especially if you're someone who struggles to talk about their achievements, these are some good guidelines. This is also great for brainstorming if you have little to no experience, like for example, if you've just finished a boot camp and you want advice on how to talk about things on your resume. I prompt, I'm a front-end developer who is looking for my first job. I have experience working on a project management application as part of a 6-week internship, as well as several completed boot camp projects. Act as a resume expert and make suggestions for how I can craft a resume. We look at the outputs, advices. As a new front-end developer looking for your first job, your resume should focus on your relevant project skills and education and offer some suggestions for structuring your resume Some of this advice is arguable. I don't know about putting an objective statement on your resume. I've heard that that is getting to be a little old fashioned, but again, that's something that you would want to check for yourself and your own specific needs. And so these are just basically suggestions for sections that you could put on your resume. And here's an example of what it might look like. So front end developer intern, company name, dates, along with a description of the things you did and any certifications that you've earned. Another thing you can do that comes in really handy is I have gotten these qualifications from some job ad on LinkedIn, and I am going to dump it into ChatGPT and say, I want to apply for this job. Here's a description of my current position. Please make suggestions for how I can tailor this section for the job that I want. Ask clarifying questions if necessary. And then here is where you might put in a description of your current job, but I'm using the fake one that I used ChatGPT to generate for me. So I think this is pretty cool. This prompts ChatGPT to ask me questions about my experience related to the job qualifications that I gave it. Do you have experience with web accessibility standards or guidelines? How comfortable are you with working independently? And so on. So I'll go ahead and answer all of these questions. And ChatGPT will use that to tailor my resume. This could potentially be a really huge time saver. At this point, I've spent a long time having a conversation with ChatGPT about my skills and experience. I'm going to take advantage of the back and forth we've had so far and ask it to write me an elevator pitch. While prompt, I have a phone screen with the recruiter next week. Based on all the information I've given you so far, write a 30-second elevator pitch that I can use to introduce myself. Pause this and read through it if you want. It writes me a nice short speech that I can use to introduce myself and talk about my skills in a really succinct way. I can also take advantage of this conversation by starting to ask ChatGPT how I can answer certain interview questions, especially one that a lot of recruiters ask, which is tell me about yourself. And it gives me some suggestions for how to do that. But stay tuned because we'll talk a lot more in the next scrim about how to use AI to practice interviewing. So see you there. We've previously discussed ways that AI can help you with technical interviewing, but it can also help you with behavioral interviewing, which can sometimes be just as big of a challenge. To find out how ChatGPT can help with behavioral questions, I decided to start by asking it, how can you help me as a front-end developer practice behavioral job interviews? It responds, behavioral interviews typically involve questions about your past work experience and how you handled specific situations in the workplace. And it says it can help us do mock interviews, use the STAR method, which is a way to structure your interview answer questions. It can give feedback, information about industry trends and knowledge, and can also review your interview questions. The first thing it says it can help with is mock interview questions. So I'm going to say, let's start with some practice questions. The result is a list of questions based on teamwork, problem solving, technical skill, leadership, and so on. These are all broad topics, so I'll start by concentrating on one of these areas first. Then I'll say I want to specifically practice the STAR method. Please give me a STAR method example for the first question. If you're not familiar with the STAR method, hopefully this will help you understand it. So our response is absolutely. Here's an example of how you might use the STAR method to respond to the question. Can you tell me about a time you had a conflict with a team member? How did you handle it? So you first explain a situation. The example is that I was working at Excellent Software Company. We were working on a large project with a tight deadline, and a team member, let's call him Bob, who is constantly missing our daily stand-ups and failing to meet his coding deadlines. The task is that we felt we had to address the issue, and this is the action that we took. We had a one-on-one meeting with Bob to discuss my observations, and then you talk about the results. Bob was initially defensive, but he appreciated my approach and opened up about some personal issues that were affecting his work. And after our talk, Bob's participation and output improved considerably. Way to go, Bob. So it can be pretty difficult to think of scenarios to talk about during a job interview. So I find these examples to be very helpful. And in my interviewing experience, some companies will actually ask you specifically to use the STAR method. It is a really worthy endeavor to get used to how it's structured and get used to answering interview questions that way. I've seen an example. I understand the STAR method a little bit better. Now I need help brainstorming some scenarios that I can use to answer this question. What are some situations where a front-end developer might have conflict with a team member? This is a way that I can start to think about my own personal stories. So hopefully the AI is going to come back with something that will remind me of something that happened to me at work so that I will have a good answer for the question, how do I deal with conflict with a team member? It comes up with several good possibilities, differing opinions on design, code quality, misalignment on priorities, project direction disagreements, communication issues, and workload imbalance. Hopefully, a list like this will help you think of situations that happened in your own work experiences that you can talk about during a behavioral interview. I can also ask for behavioral interview questions related to a specific area that I want to work on. Say I'm looking for a job as a lead developer or an engineering manager, and I want to practice talking about my leadership experience. I can prompt, please ask me 5 behavioral interview questions related to my leadership experience. And AI has a lot of good ideas for that. Taking initiative, resolving conflict, making decisions, mentoring, or leading a project. It then reminds you that a really good way to practice answering these questions is by using the STAR method. I can ask for example answers based on my experience level. If I'm asked the question, what are your strengths and weaknesses? Not only can this be a really difficult question to answer because you're never quite sure what they're looking for when they ask this question, but your answer might be different if you're an entry-level developer versus a principal level engineer. So the prompt is, I'm interviewing for an entry-level web developer position. How can I answer the question, what are your strengths and weaknesses? The AI comes back with, as an entry-level candidate, you'll want to highlight your strengths and weaknesses in a way that communicates your potential for growth, your ability to learn, and your dedication to the profession. So your strengths might be more focused on your education, internship, or personal traits that will help you succeed in the role. And here's an example of how you might answer, and you can pause if you'd like to read through it. Some of the same ideas for answering the weakness portion of the question, and posits that the key is to show that you are aware of areas of improvement and that you are actively working on them. So it uses the example of working on my familiarity with certain web development tools and frameworks. There's still a lot for me to learn, but here's all the things that I'm doing to make sure that I'm learning and getting hands-on experience. This is some pretty decent advice, but of course you'll want to tailor it to your specific situation, as we're just using the AI to generate ideas and jumping off points. Here's a prompt that will encourage ChatGPT to act as your interview coach. I am interviewing for a junior front-end developer position, and I want to practice answering questions about my technical knowledge. Acting as my interview coach, ask me questions and provide me with feedback on my answers. With this kind of prompt, you can get an endless number of questions essentially about your technical skills and get a lot of practice answering a variety of different questions. So this is a really powerful tool. The back and forth goes something like this. It starts with a double and triple equals equality question, which I would say is pretty appropriate for a junior level developer. So I went ahead and made up an answer to the question talking about type checking and type coercion. ChatGPT says my explanation is great. Thanks, ChatGPT. And then goes on to ask me another question. The question that it asks is, can you explain how CSS Flexbox works and give an example of a scenario where you'd choose to use it? In my opinion, this is a super cool thing about AI. If I were reading this off a list that I found on Google and I didn't know the answer, I would simply have to move on to the next question or do some research and formulate an answer without a lot of feedback. So let's pretend that I don't know quite how to answer this question. So my follow-up prompt will be, I'm actually not sure how to succinctly explain how Flexbox works. Can you give me an example of a solid, brief answer? And that will help me answer it a little better or collect my thoughts so I can answer it a little better next time. It then moves on to a third question. How would you approach making a website more accessible? What are some key considerations to keep in mind? This time, I'm going to answer this question incorrectly. My answer is, to make a website accessible, you want to make sure that you have a really good URL that closely matches the subject matter of your website. Otherwise, your customers might have trouble finding it. ChatGPT responds, that's a great point regarding search engine optimization, but when we talk about accessibility in web development, we're generally referring to making web content usable for people of all abilities and disabilities. And then it gives us some pointers for how to enhance a website's accessibility. What I think is really cool about using AI to practice interview questions is that you could easily go on Google and find a list of these questions somewhere and maybe maybe even read the answers. But what you can't get is real-time feedback or help with how you might go about answering the question. And you might be able to find the answer to the question, but it's not going to feel as interactive. So I find this a lot more fun and engaging way to practice these kind of interview questions. I hope you found these ideas useful. I personally find behavioral interviewing to be really tough, and I appreciate having a brainstorming buddy like ChatGPT. So happy interviewing, and I'll see you later. Congratulations! You finished the course and are now a capable prompt engineer and superpowered developer who can harness the power of AI to accomplish a huge variety of tasks. Let's go ahead and recap a little bit of what you've learned. We covered the basics of prompt engineering: specificity, context, technical language, controlling the length and formatting of responses, breaking down tasks and prompts iteratively, optimizing prompts, role-based prompting, and prompting by example. We also covered AI-assisted coding. That's using natural language models to generate code with pseudocode and pseudo language, also generating test cases and edge cases, debugging, converting and documenting code, and avoiding pitfalls like hallucinating and copy-paste loops. And finally, we looked at how you can use AI to help in your job search, including learning, generating, and practicing DS and Algo coding challenges, tailoring resumes and cover letters, and practicing interviewing. You've done an incredible job. Now go forth and prompt engineer something amazing.